Hello, welcome. This is the Death of the Reader extended cut here on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour, and it's time for the long one, Herds.
Yeah, this is going to be a very long time. We're going through 4 weeks of content.
Yeah.
I love it. It's like a movie. It's like a sit-in movie. Get yourself a bag of popcorn, maybe a loved one, maybe a pet, and sit in for the long haul.
Yes, we received some messages that were like, where's the extended cut? Where's the extended cut? We're putting all 4 of them together because it's the one author, it's the one train of thought.
It's a special feature.
We are covering the Benson murder case and the Kennel murder case by S.S. Van Dyne.
Special feature.
We covered the book of the Benson murder case, but the movie, Herds, the movie.
Yeah, for the Kennel case, which I'm particularly excited for everybody to talk about. It's a bit of a different take with the author, but I think it works pretty well.
Yeah, so over the course of the next couple of hours, you'll be sitting down and joining with us the whole way through the Benson murder case and the Kennel murder case. We'll be speaking with Geoff Field, 2SER's very own news director. We'll be speaking with writer on LA Noir, Daniel McMahon.
Particularly excited for that one. After that, we're chatting with Dr. Chris Cody, an expert on jazz and musicology, and Dr. Mike Grost, Van Dyne specialist extraordinaire from America.
If you aren't familiar with Dr. Mike Grost's work, you absolutely should be. He is an encyclopedia of murder mystery knowledge, and we use his website a lot for research and information, so it was fantastic actually getting him on the show, and we're really excited to share that with you.
Yeah, he's been an invaluable resource. So strap in, get ready for the wild ride of your life.
Up right now, we'll be talking chapters 1 to 8 of the Benson murder case, where we'll discuss the 20 rules of Van Dyne. We'll discuss a little bit about all these characters walking around the book, and we will perhaps see the easiest puzzle I think we've ever had.
Maybe the next will be harder. We'll see.
We will find out. This is the Death of the Reader extended cut. You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds bringing you your Murder Mystery World Tour as we take you around all of the best murder mystery in history.
We've gone everywhere. We've gone France, we've gone England, and now we're all the way over in comfy America for our next book.
We'll be elsewhere eventually, but
hopefully.
we have to trace those inspirations to get there.
I want to get to China at some point. That's where I want to go.
Yeah,
My goodness.
I'm very excited to get to those Eastern mysteries at some point, but this week we are tackling the Benson murder case by S.S. Van Dyne.
Yes, I hope you're enjoying this one. I figured I'd go hunt down a novel that you might thoroughly enjoy. I know how much you love the chase, the puzzle, the hunt. I figured, Flex, that this would be right up your alley.
Oh, you have me a marked man, sir. Van Dyne, we came to from Anna Catherine Green because they were kind of American contemporaries, early 20th century writers, murder mystery, both kind of roughly based out of New York. But one of the difficulties with S.S. Van Dyne is that he was so secretive about his early writing career that it's very hard to actually trace who inspired him.
Yeah.
At least up until the point where he spoils another author's book in the middle of one of his, then you easily know who he's read.
And then you regret everything because now we can't do that book. We can't do that book now. But yeah, it's funny watching Van Dyne or trying to trace his novels, because he was so financially successful, and yet I've never heard anyone mention him in my life, until looking into this show and fairly recently.
Yeah, it's so strange because by numbers, he is America's Agatha Christie, but he has just disappeared from pop culture in a way that Agatha Christie has absolutely not.
It's very strange. I wonder why. These are the mysteries. These are the true mysteries of the show.
I guess the thing I wanted to open the show talking about was Van Dyne himself, because he's a fascinating character. He was basically an academic, magazine writer and editor. Not in the way that we typically think of magazines, more like research publications and that sort of thing. Kind of, if you're familiar with The Conversation, which is a website which we have a lot of academics here in Australia.
Not our conversation, not one of our conversations recently,
the
just
website,
the generic,
the conversation.
The branded conversation. Okay,
yes.
Good. Are you sure we can say that on air? Are we getting troll for that?
You're welcome, The Conversation. But if you're... Basically, his publications were, very highbrow kind of writing.
Yes. Highbrow is definitely the term I would use. My goodness. The detective in this novel is wonderful. But we'll get to him.
But basically, the man, as many rich people in early 20th century America may have had, he had a cocaine addiction.
Yes. This is the fun story of the Benson murder case. This is, to me, the most interesting part is that, not the story itself, but the whole reason it got put together was that I believe his psychologist was like, hey, you have this awful cocaine addiction. You need to find something to occupy your mind. And Van Dyne, he said, why don't you try these murder mystery novels? And Van Dyne or Willard Wright said, well, that's all very, very pop culture. I don't think I could quite get into that. But he started reading them, and then he eventually decided to write a very highbrow murder mystery with the most highbrow of highbrow detectives that lived on this high side of Brow Street.
The interesting thing about Van Dyne compared to other murder mystery authors is you hear a lot of murder mystery authors talk about how they kind of start the book and they don't really know who's going to be the culprit by the end.
Yeah.
Whereas Van Dyne planned 6 books before he put pen to page for his first one.
He has the kind of insanity, I think, Flex, that you might also have.
That's the point I was very interested in, is that Van Dyne reads like the kind of author I am afraid I would be.
Yeah. I mean, why don't you try writing a murder mystery novel and see how that goes? Spend 20 years writing 6 books, release them all at once, and then just go to town.
I'm very scared about that. But yeah, so this one, the Benson murder case, is the first one in his stories, the Philo Vance mysteries.
Yeah. And it was very successful.
It was very successful.
Financially.
And it was based off an actual murder case, the death of Mr. Elwell in New York, whose death was unsolved and the circumstances were near identical to the ones in this book. It is interesting that S.S. Van Dyne, the character, as S.S. Van Dyne is a pseudonym he uses, the character actually references the murder case that the book is based off.
It's ridiculous.
And says that the murder happened after the book, as though he's claiming credit for history, which I really love.
The entire setup for this novel is ridiculous. Like, as we say, it's very well planned out and analytical and all those sorts of things. We also have a first instance of an author integrating themselves into the novel.
And he integrates himself so hard.
He does. Not in the sense that his character is a detective, which would have been a blunder on his part, but in the sense that he's there as the chronicler, the person who sits down with the book and takes down all of the wacky adventures of Mr. Philo Vance.
He is the Watson if you took all of the fun parts out of Watson.
If you took all the fun parts out, you get to Markham, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose
real
that's
Watson
true.
of this particular novel.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons, as we said, he took this pseudonym so that people wouldn't know it was him, because he didn't want his reputation as an academic tarnished by writing pop culture. Which is hilarious to me. But I suppose going on from that, we should talk about Philo Vance and S.S. Van Dyne, because they are incredibly unlikable men.
They're insufferable. I hate them. Why are we reading this novel?
They are utterly insufferable. The thing about this book, if I had to sum up this book in as few sentences as possible, I would have to say that it is either so self-aware it's incredible, or so blind it's double-blinded itself into self-awareness.
I'd agree with that. Yeah, that's about right.
Everything comes across as so incredibly pretentious and forthright that it reads like a joke unless you know the context. One of the quotes that we found in researching this book was a critic who wrote that Philo Vance needs a kick in the pants.
Hey, that was a Chandler, was it?
I think so.
I should find that.
And by God, the man does.
Yeah. It's funny that when we think of these sorts of characters in popular culture, as I often think about the Robert Downey Jr. Impersonations of Sherlock Holmes, characters like this, they're so incredibly insufferable. They always know exactly what to say. They always say, I thought the solution to the mystery was positively simple. I had to figure it out in 5 to 10 minutes. And you took a whole week of going about and talking to people. Awful. Usually those people have terrible character flaws. I don't even know if Philo Vance has one. I think he's just perfect and also insufferable.
His character flaw is his perfection.
I suppose so. He's also a consumer of fine art. He has a lovely life with lots of connections to people. He's wealthy. What does this man do all day? He just buys art.
I mean, the premise of the story is that he's so bored he asked the police to have him tag along.
I know. It's awful.
The thing is,
could I just pick up a murder mystery of a real dead person? Wouldn't that be fun,
There's
Mummy?
one line at the start of the book where Van Dyne, the character, goes, I don't know why he chose me for his extra scholastic activities. And it's probably because you both use that kind of language.
Both just as awful as each other.
And I mean, one of the things I do love about the way that this book is constructed and the way that it uses the pretentiousness is that all of their pretentious chat comes back around. Like when they're talking at art right at the start, the things he's saying about art at the start come around to discussions about evidence and clues later on with Markham, which is still absolutely obnoxiously pretentious, but I think really nicely integrates that pretentiousness into the story. If I had to look at this book and say, why did Van Dyne write this story? Why did Huntington write this story this way? He was just angry with poor people, dumb people, psychics.
Yeah.
Just
He's
the
just
list.
fed up.
The list goes on.
He projects so hard onto Philo Vance in everything that he does. He says, "Well, isn't it silly that people spend so much time thinking about things that are incredibly simple and straightforward?" He's awful.
And the thing is when he's not projecting through Philo Vance, he's projecting through SS Van Dyne.
Yeah, so he just jumps back between the two of them. It's perfect. And everyone else is just an idiot.
And the thing is, it is horrible. It is horrible in that if you knew these people, I would tell you to see a psychologist.
Yes.
If you called yourself friends with these people, you need help. But I loved reading it.
Get some better friends. Get some non-pretentious friends. Get some friends like down in the dumps. Go to a bar, meet a nice lady or man or other, and just have a good time.
Just be careful that you don't accidentally end up shot in your apartment, like Alvin Benson.
That's why we stay away from apartments. We go to the nightclubs. You're very safe there. That's what I hear.
So Alvin Benson was found murdered in his home, sitting down with most of his clothes off and a lady's belongings lying around the place.
Non-suspicious belongings.
Non-suspicious belongings.
Definitely not a woman who did this.
I did want to talk about the fact that we are back to being frustrated with women again. Going back to that list of things that Van Dyne hates, women seem to be on there. We kind of took a break with Anna Catherine Green and, we started with a break from Ronald Knox, but, Golden Age era detective fiction was before feminism and God, it shows.
Yep. I hope you're ready for the rest of this novel. The way that he talks about women in relation to the crime, it is ridiculous. Philo Vance, not a ladies' man.
Yeah,
in any sense of the word.
If you're getting into Golden Age detective fiction
not this
crime,
one. No.
I wouldn't, this is definitely not a beginner's novel, but the point that I was going to make is that if you're getting into this kind of story, you should know what you're in for, and that is disrespect on many, many groups of people.
Yes.
Because that was kind of the way of the era, and, there's nothing you can really do to change that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a broader discussion on recreating old works for modern times, but if you're going to go back and read these old books, you got to be prepared for a little bit of non-sensibilities.
Yeah. Tailing off that, though, we do have our prime suspect in this case, Muriel St. Clair. At least I think it's St. Clair. Is that a name people have? I've never actually heard anyone named Saint in modern times.
Maybe she is a saint. Maybe she was blessed by the Pope, and now she's a St. Clair.
Maybe
Who knows?
She is.
Maybe she's just old.
So Muriel St. Clair is a, well-to-do sort in New York City, an actress, singer who has her belongings found in the victim's house. Her alibi is incredibly flaky. And the question is, how could it be anyone but her?
It couldn't have been a woman. A woman couldn't have done it. Why, Philo Vance? Because a woman couldn't have done it. What?
Now, I'll tell you coming up in the latter part of the show why I think that sentence is accurate if flawed.
Sure.
But yeah, the evidence against her seems tantamount, and it's very hard to pick through using the layman's brain as far as Philo Vance is concerned, how it could be done by anybody else.
Well, you need to think about it psychologically, not with hard evidence or facts or witnesses. You have to think about the psychology of it.
Well, that was another really strange aspect to this story, is that there is so much talk of psychology and analyzing the way that people think. But the first time we sit down, in fact, both times we sit down with suspects and talk with them, we skip half the conversation. We don't get to see their reaction to most of the questions.
It is strange that the way that Philo Vance is written, the way that he thinks about psychology is through taking clues and saying, this is the reason why it was here. Here's the psychological reasoning behind why all this stuff happened in the past, rather than I'm thinking Lie to Me, shows where we see the facial expressions of the characters and we can see the gears turning in someone's brain. A lot of what Philo Vance says, maybe to me with my layman's brain, I can't quite comprehend it, but he seems to extrapolate a lot more than what's there. But okay, maybe it'll come around at the end and make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that S.S. Van Dyne, the author, or Willett Huntington Wright, doesn't seem to get is that there is multiple ways a clue can be interpreted.
Yeah.
And like when I say he doesn't get it, it's that his presumption seems to be through Philo Vance that there is a perfect way to interpret each clue. Yep. He obviously accepts that there are multiple interpretations because that's how all of his red herrings are functioning.
Sure.
But there is always a clear line that is the most accurate according to him, which I think is just not the way the world works.
Yes. There is always a moment, I think, in detective novels where I'm thinking in my head, well, we have this piece of evidence. It could mean either this or that. But with Philo Vance, he seems to say, well, this is the clue, therefore this must be true. And then he just carries that through line. And he's probably right because he's Philo Vance and he can do no wrong.
No, and I do think that when it comes to looking at detective fiction and reading through the story once you've gone back over it, that whole experience of rereading that we've spoken about several times, the clues that Huntington Wright lays down, when you read back over them, they will look you in the face and go like, this is what was happening. Like, it will make sense. I just don't think that it's quite as compelling for the first read through. But going back to that whole thing about double blinding himself into self-awareness, it is also simultaneously what makes that so fantastic because he just always knows every time. Yeah,
there's definitely an element of, quaintness, which I talk about a lot with these novels, where we come back to something from a very long time ago and say, gee, isn't that funny that they used to talk that way? But with Philo Vance, it's, gee, isn't it funny that this character is supposedly flawless, is written as intended to be flawless, and yet we can see that that is the problem, which is always entertaining.
One of the things that I did actually really like about the pretentiousness of this novel is the discussion between Markham and Philo Vance about evidence and interpreting evidence.
Yes.
I think that, it's obviously still pretentious. Let's just get that out of the way. But the way that it explores how other novels have used evidence and the way that it explores how you can interpret actions differently, I think is really compelling. The only thing that I find slightly off-putting is that Wright is arguing against the death of the author theory in Chapter 6 while writing a story where I really wish I could accept death of the author and believe that it wasn't as pretentious as it reads.
Yeah.
I think one of the beautiful dichotomies of the way that this novel presents accurate crime is the comparison between, that discussion between Markham and Vance where they're talking about how to use evidence and them just all walking into the crime scene and sitting down on the chairs in the room the man was killed. Like, guys, this is a crime scene. You know that, right?
You can't just walk in here and take our chairs and move our stuff around. Yeah. No.
I think that was really fun. And then there's also that whole thing where they're going over the realities of crime reporting where, we've touched on some of the other novels like in The Floating Admiral where there's the reporter running around trying to figure out what's going on. The whole question of the press when it comes to murder mystery is often kind of glazed over. But this novel actually has the press kind of play into the story in a fun way where the detectives are thinking to themselves, which piece of evidence do we feed to the press to tide them over while we actually solve this thing, which I thought was a really neat detail. And I'm excited to see if it comes back around and actually lends us something later on in the story.
Well, we've already had newspapers and stories kind of mentioned in the early part where Van Dyne is obviously discussing the fame of his detective friend, and now it's his duty to chronicle it down as it was.
Yeah. Obviously it does play a factor in the story, but I'm wondering whether that's just an attention to detail thing or whether it's something that, maybe some reporter will go, I was looking for cars to photograph and I found the car you're looking for.
I hope so.
I hope so, too.
That Cadillac? That shiny Cadillac?
That shiny
My
Cadillac.
Goodness.
Now, Herds, you remember those 10 Commandments of Father Knox that we've discussed so much on this show?
Yes, far too many of them, in fact.
Yes, now, too many of them?
Too many. 10 is too many. Why can't there just be 1 or 2 or 3?
I have terrible news for you.
Oh, no.
Van Dyne wrote 20 plus appendices.
That's too many. That's just too many rules. That's like 30 plus rules.
We'll be talking about this coming up a bit later on the show.
Good luck.
This is Death of the Reader. This is Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds, and we are here with the powerhouse that is Geoff Field, your news director here at 2SER, responsible for keeping Sydney informed through the week on what's happening all around the world. Geoff, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Felix, and I'll pay you later. What an introduction. Incredible. Look, first of all, can I compliment you guys for Death of the Reader? Because I feel we live in a day and age of people scrolling. I get on a train. See people scrolling. I go into the newsroom. I see not our newsroom, of course. I see people scrolling. So no one is actually taking time. Though actually lots of people are taking time, but too many people just scroll through headline after headline. And you know what? I love a good book. Whenever I go on holidays, I switch off social media. But you're going to hate me for this because I read biographies.
Oh, no.
But you may well switch me here because what we're about to talk about has got me intrigued.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's a pleasure to have you on, Geoff. I hope that you're excited to talk about SS Van Dyne or Willard Huntington Wright and all the wonderful things he's gotten up to, such as addiction, such as a wonderful family life, such as writing murder mystery novels.
You've got me in.
I think one of the most interesting things I want to kick off, just a little factoid out on the table, is there is a 1992 biography of SS Van Dyne by John Lowery, which is absolutely fascinating. I've been picking my way through it, and like it just goes through fact after fact after fact that has me sitting there like, is this man even real? The opening preface of the book says that the author had difficulty finding out details about his life because he intentionally wrote letters to mislead people as to who he was.
Absolutely. And, one of the first things I did when Felix said to me, he said, do you want to be on Death of the Reader? And I yes, but I was honest and I said, I'm not into detective fiction. I'm a real biography person, probably because I've worked in radio stations where I've met lots of celebrities and I want to actually find out if they're as off the planet as they appear to be when they come into the radio station. And in most cases, yes. However, I've got to say, this has really pricked my interest because I've had a look. I'll be honest, I haven't read his books, but I think I want to. I think I want to download or go into a bookstore and buy one because I was reading the Washington Post, and this is what really, first of all, got my attention. Wright was one of the oddest ducks one could ever hope or dread to meet. For most of his brief life, he was a peripheral figure in American literacy and artistic circles, a smart, erudite, controversial man who never managed to achieve the intellectual respectability he craved. When fame eventually came to him, he was the author of popular detective novels. Now, let me just tell the listeners that he started off being a critic, slamming detective novels, and he ended up being a man that wrote detective novels. And his personal life, that in itself is enough to make me buy his books. He was basically a mess. He divorced, well, lots of people divorced, but he divorced two people. I won't go into all the details. He was a drug addict. That didn't kill him, but addiction to brandy ended up killing him at the tender age of 51. And I find it fascinating, Felix and Ben, that he was so critical. Like I read a few things and I went, whoa. A few things he said about detective novels, which like probably would have put me off reading them. And then he went on to achieve his golden moments by writing detective novels. How's that for juxtaposition?
He was credited as being the most zealous literary critic of his time.
He was fierce.
He absolutely ripped into everything that was pop culture. But the thing that I really love is that because he was so engaged and absolutely critical of detective fiction, when he got into it, he knew what he was doing.
Can I ask you guys, okay, for someone like me that has admitted that I only read biographies, that makes me a voyeur, I know. And my partner does read fiction and detective novel. He loves reading about Venice murders and things like that. What would be the one that I should start with?
I've got to pitch you between two stories here. Now, one of them Herds here is more familiar with because he is the veteran going through it. I'm only partway through this book. And the other one I've read all the way through. Now, Herds, the Benson murder case, to me, stands out as something that is absolutely self-projection.
Yes, this is the reason why we love the Benson murder case, because it's not just a story about some characters. It is Wright putting himself into a murder mystery novel and saying, this is how I do it better. And his ego, his incredibly inflated ego, is on full display. If you want to see the closest approximation of Wright's actual character, read the Benson murder case. It is perfectly an example of that.
Yeah. And on the other hand, I would pitch to you the Kennel murder case, which is that blend of his incredible ego coupled with a bit of learning of how the audience responds to his works, a bit more humanity portrayed through it, but still intrinsically him.
We work in radio.
Yes.
We work with egos.
Yes.
But this man's ego seemed extraordinary from the things that I read, because I did a little bit of research before I came in. Like, the man, he was fearless. He, let's go back to the fact that he ripped into people that wrote detective novels and then it ended up being a writer, but being the focus of the novels. So that's a double whammy in one. I mean, the man had, can I say it on air? The man had balls.
I think one of the other most fascinating things about getting into his actual novels is that he's obviously been a very zealous literary critic. He's obviously very forthright. He's obviously got the balls, as you say, Geoff. But then when we actually get to reading his novels, we aren't sure reading them whether he's so self-aware that it's enlightenment or whether he's so utterly blind as to how he's carrying himself that he double blinds himself into self-awareness, which is something you'll hear us say a lot on the coming weeks of the show.
And the other layer of what you just said, of that in itself, to try and work your way through that, is he was also on drugs and an alcoholic. So that just makes it even more of a mystery. Wow, he is one hell of a subject that you've got me in for. I mean, you name it, and he's done it.
Yeah. I think, as we were mentioning John Lowy's 1992 biography, one of the crazy things I mentioned is that he was throwing out letters to mislead his character, and he obviously didn't really like pop culture. He didn't really like the popular aspect of it. For you as a journalist, Geoff, how do you treat someone so clearly in the public eye when they so clearly don't want to be?
Oh, that's difficult. Everyone's a separate case. But this guy, from what I've read, and I say I'm no expert on this, I think he was longing for attention.
Really?
I mean, I do. Look, you could say that he was, hiding behind things and what have you, but in the end, I know, and of course he had the pseudonym, but I think in the end he wanted attention. And he obviously had such a mess of a private life. And the poor guy was, addicted to everything. If it was there to drink or there to snort, he did it. To me, that was crying out for help.
Yeah.
And look, this is why I want to read his stuff. Not because he was a drug addict, but because he fascinates me already. From, I read that Washington Post review. John Lowy, is that correct?
Correct.
I read that, and that was enough to make me think, okay, I might go to the other side and buy some fiction.
That's good. I'm glad that we've convinced you at least that far, Geoff.
Get back to me in a few months' time, because I'm about to go on an overseas holiday, and I've got my bios lined up, but I've got a feeling the one you mentioned just then, which was, again,
Benson
I have to
murder
write
case.
have you got a pen there?
It's all right. It's this week's episode. Geoff will send
right.
Tune into the episode.
I'll tune in because I think that's the one I should start with. He's like, in so many cases, he confuses me. And as I think the word juxtaposition really suits this man in so many ways, in every aspect of his life, whether it's hiding his name, whether it's being a critic of a genre that eventually was his living. I mean, that would be like me saying, I can't stand news or newsreaders. Actually, there's a few. But, Jen, you know what I'm saying. It's just like a crazy thing. And his life he seemed to be a very conflicted person.
Yeah.
Dying at 51.
Yeah.
I
think that the point that you make that he obviously has this crying out for help and he wants this attention, but he can't show himself using his novels and using Philo Vance and even inserting himself. This is another fun thing about the Benson murder case. He inserts himself as a character into the novel as Van Dyne. And all of these things are examples of how he's trying to create a legend around this detective and this murder mystery fiction without putting himself on the main stage. Building that story maybe is more important to him than anything else.
Well, you guys who are a lot more knowledgeable on this than me, how do you feel about this particular from the Washington Post, from John Lowy, where he says, I found this really interesting. He maintains precisely the right distance between himself and his subjects, and precisely the right degree of empathy. Does that ring bells with you?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a bit of a weird criticism to make because it's perhaps contextualized to the time at which he was writing. Because on the one hand, his detective is able to relate to almost any character. They can walk into the room and be instantly charismatic and have everyone at their beck and call, which on the one hand is one of the things where I was saying maybe he double-blinded himself into self-awareness. But on the other hand, later down the line, and this is something we'll talk about coming up on some of the later episodes of the show, he actually was a very early proponent of civil rights movements.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and in a time where it wasn't as socially acceptable, there's a lot of undertones of acceptance of gays, minorities, ethnicities that wasn't present in other novels at the time.
Do you think he went to his grave, or do you think in his latter years, as he knew he was ailing, do you think that he knew that he was going to leave a legacy, or do you think he was jaded?
Oh, Geoff, this is the first curveball.
There's a great question.
He
didn't want to, is the thing. He didn't want to leave a legacy of this pop culture nonsense this drivel that he was writing into. But the funny thing about Wright is that he hasn't had as lengthy of a legacy as Knox or Agatha Christie are much more well known in the modern age. Wright at the time was very fiscally successful, but nobody really talks about him. I hadn't really heard about him before coming to this novel, really.
Yeah. So after he died was like, okay, someone like David Bowie dies and there's an immediate like, hail David Bowie, everyone gets his music out. Was there sort of a lapse between him dying and people actually appreciating his work or him coming onto the radar of the literary world?
Well, he was very successful while he was still alive. He made a lot of money and died to the brandy addiction. Obviously, he must have been pretty well off in that regard.
Brandy's not cheap.
It's not cheap.
Told.
No, so we're told. Not any experience there.
I don't know.
But I haven't found anything about his death making big waves. I haven't seen a huge amount of attention on that. I think that he made his splash while he was still alive, and then he faded basically out of existence. There are still those 20 rules, the Van Dyne's 20 rules of detective fiction that we have to roll off of, but I don't think that there was a huge conundrum about it, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I mean, he died in 1939, which means he was fronting up right to the war.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing, and this is not something that I can be terribly confident in saying because we haven't read the final 6 novels of the 12-novel Philo Vance series.
Too many.
But he planned the original 6, and then the latter 6 kind of came at a whim, more or less. And I think, according to some critics I've read, his lack of passion started to show itself going into those final 6 novels. So by the time he passed away in 1939, people weren't as fond of Philo Vance.
Yeah,
I get that. Do you think he was a bitter man? That's one word that springs to mind. The whole critical, yet I'll do it thing, the alcoholism, the drug addiction. Was he bitter?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the impression
that didn't take you long to answer that.
That's something that we've been thinking about a lot because a lot of the subtext of this rule set that he made, which is basically his rules for how he thinks detective novels should be written, a lot of them say, it should only focus on people of note, like people who aren't ordinary jobbed.
People with money, people of status, people that matter to my personal life because that is the class that I am in American society. In the early 20th century. Yeah, that's definitely the impression that I get. And also, as we say, these rules, they feel like personal attacks on specific mystery authors. And certainly the way that he goes about in the Benson murder case, trying to debunk all these mysteries, he says, well, the detective has solved it in 5 minutes, apparently. That's the thing that he kind of pushes.
So after the whole, being so mean and critical, do you think he came over and was more appreciative of other writers in his genre?
It's very difficult to say. I think the short answer is yes, but it's more of an appreciation for what they had to put up with as public figures than it was
a talent as a writer. Yeah, sure.
Because as I said, according to other critics I've read, his novels started to feel passionless in the latter 6, and that's when he finally stepped out of his shell and, had his Iron Man moment and said, I am SS Van Dyne, whereas up until then he'd been anonymous.
A last desperate call for help, perhaps.
So you mentioned that book, but so his earlier body of work was his most acclaimed work.
Yes.
Yes.
His magnum opus was in collection, the first 6 books featuring Philo Vance. Well, he also would have been driven to kick the cocaine addiction, right? He had a drive. He had, a point to prove with his detective to show this is how you should write a detective fiction mystery. He had a point to say that this medium that he said, was totally trash before, this is the merit to it. This is why it's actually a very intellectual medium. And yeah, he had all his personal problems. He was using this outlet to work through, which I think makes him pretty human, ironically, at the end of the day.
Yeah. Were the drugs and the alcohol affecting his latter works?
That's very difficult to say. Again, we haven't read the latter 6.
Yeah.
It's definitely something we might get at further down the line on our Murder Mystery World Tour if we return to America.
Maybe we'll have you on again, have a chat about that, eh?
Yeah, I could be an expert by
if we can get you to read the whole 12 books.
Yeah.
Well, either way, this has been Death of the Reader. We've been talking with your news director, Geoff Field. Geoff, thank you very much for joining us on the show.
It's been my pleasure, and well done again for keeping the art of reading alive, because I feel I see too many people on their phones. Read, people. Read, and listen to this podcast.
Thank you very much, Geoff, for the resounding endorsement.
Okay.
We will carry on with our discussion of if the Benson murder case is fair thus far, how I think I can solve it, up next on Death of the Reader. You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER, and it's time, Herds, to solve the Benson murder case.
Well, it's time for you to solve it. I get to
yes.
sit here and know exactly what's going on.
That's
and
true.
mislead you like some kind of crazy criminal mastermind.
We have read from chapters 1 to 8, which is a third of the way through the book, as we normally do.
Yeah.
And Herds, I reckon this is the most in the bag we have it.
This is the easy one?
This is the easy one.
Are you kidding me?
And I'll tell you why. It's because of Van Dyne's 20 rules, which we touched on right at the end of the first section of the show. Now, the 20 rules that Van Dyne wrote, you can get a full rundown of them on the podcast. But basically, they go into great detail about what Van Dyne thinks makes a detective story good.
Well, they'd only be helpful if you spent the time reading through the 8 chapters and then cross-referencing each chapter with each of the 20 rules. And nobody's crazy enough to spend that much time on something like a murder novel.
So you remember that part earlier in the show where I was talking about how I was paranoid that I would be the kind of writer that Huntington Wright is?
I do remember that.
Yes.
Tell me more.
Herds, I did that.
Why?
Because I have a reputation to uphold.
It's true.
And
It's
because
true.
I enjoy it.
Well, I'm glad that you're the one with the reputation here. I hope you enjoy that. I don't want to ask how many hours of time you spent slaving over those
Neither
rules,
do I,
but
for that matter.
At least we can get something out of it in the end. So who's your culprit? You want to talk
My
about that?
culprit is Major Benson.
Okay, fair enough.
Now, I will tell you right out the gate, the rule that I think is most prevalent and relevant here in this novel is the fact that it cannot be servants.
Okay.
And it also cannot be the detective. And there cannot be a gaggle of detectives, all right? From chapters 1 to 8, the characters that we have had introduced that are not police officers or servants is 3 people. Arguably 4, the 4th of which hasn't made any appearance whatsoever. So basically, we have Muriel St. Clair, Captain Lecoq, who is most definitely 100%ly named after Emile Gaborio's detective of a similar name.
Can you spell influence?
There's also a Moriarty on the characters list. I'm excited to meet him.
Excellent.
And Major Benson.
Now, Major Benson is on the force, though, isn't he? Is that what's going on there?
No, he's an army major.
Oh, so that an army major is exempt from the rule that it can't be a detective or an officer or anything like that.
Pretty much, because first of all, he is motively connected to the crime. Second of all, he is an army major, same as Captain Lecoq, mind you.
Yeah.
And the weapon is described as an army Colt.
Okay.
All right. Third of all, we've spent a decent bit of time talking about his relationship with his brother.
Okay.
And finally, we have that glorious scene where Major Benson comes up while they're sitting down at the club and goes, "Oh, by the way, Markham, here's a guy that I didn't think of," as though it wasn't him trying to frame someone else. Nah.
Haven't you ever remembered or forgotten something really important? I forgot which bus I had to catch this morning. You just forget things.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, we know that the person that was in the house that shot Benson, according to the circumstantial evidence, which is irrelevant according to Philo Vance, but whatever.
It is. It's irrelevant.
It's
Why
irrelevant.
even use it as reasoning?
So the person must have gotten in by either being let in or by having a key. And there are only two characters with a key. One of them is the dead Benson. One of them is Mrs. Platts. Now, on a list of characters who have keys and are alive, there is a very small number of people that could have closed up the crime scene.
Fair enough, fair enough.
Which means that despite the rule that Mrs. Platts cannot be the culprit, that does not disabuse her from being an accomplice.
You think she's an accomplice?
I most definitely do. They make her seem like such an accomplice too. She's the first character we get an interrogation scene with, right? And when Philo Vance is sitting down with her, she's the one that gets all nervous when she says, "Did we have any visitors?" Because who could have let any visitors in that was alive, Herds?
Well, maybe she's just nervous because she did the dirty. She did her old master in.
No, it's
maybe
not
she's not actually a servant. Maybe she's like his secret lover or something. Wouldn't that be fun?
No. Now, I do want to say, I don't know if these rules were written before or after this novel, but
He did write 6 books in a row without stopping.
considering
so
he wrote 6
probably
books
wrote
straight,
them.
it seems like he's the kind of man that has some level of internal consistency.
Maybe.
Now, obviously we have the whole thing of the woman's handbag being in there and the gloves being in there and the cigarettes being in there and all of that wonderful
All
stuff.
of that material evidence that is hard evidence at the scene of the crime.
Hard evidence at the scene of the crime. But the first time that we hear Muriel St. Clair talk about it, she says that she lost them, which to me means that they could have been stolen or she's lying. Either of those is entirely plausible, but she doesn't seem nervous about it, which seems to me that she isn't concerned about being found out as guilty.
Why is she so? She's pretty evasive though in that interrogation that she has there.
I do agree. I think that probably her evasion there is because she's spending a night out with another man when she's, engaged.
It's true.
Which I think is obviously what they want to throw and make Lecoq suspicious. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong.
Lecoq?
Yeah, it's Lecoq.
to
But
Lecoq.
I want to pronounce it Lecoq because
Lecoq.
obviously inspiration.
Come on, guys. It's Lee Cock. Okay, just.
But basically, obviously, there are several points through this story so far up to chapter 8 where they have tried to make the captain seem outrageously suspicious. The fact that, his woman's been with another man, the fact that he has a strange but seemingly steady alibi, the fact that he's the other character that would have had access to the correct kind of weaponry. So the story and So the story and the police in the story think that it's either Muriel St. Clair or her fiancé. Both of those seem too obvious for the absolute pretentious hogwash that is SS Van Dyne. And that leaves the suspect list as a grand total of 1, maybe 2 characters. And one of which we haven't met and was only mentioned by the other suspect.
Mr. Fife?
Yes, Mr. Fife.
Yeah. Wonder how he fits in all of this.
Yeah. We also, I think that we can't get, swapped corpses or anything because it's a clean shot through the forehead, which means that the face is entirely intact and the body is very obviously dead and has gone to the mortuary and through several police officials. So, all of the standard tricks are out the gate. The only thing we have is who let them into the building and who they were.
Fair enough. We even had a munitions expert on the scene, which is very fancy.
And
I've never seen one of those in a detective novel.
And the munitions expert, I think, is another interesting piece of evidence because, and this is what I was going on in the first section of the show where I thought that whilst his clues were, shaky in saying that it couldn't have been a woman who committed the crime, that is, I think, the piece of evidence that is, going to show Muriel St. Clair as being innocent. Because it seems to me that Willett Huntington Wright would be the kind of man that would assume that a woman could not hit a headshot with a pistol at 6 feet.
What if she's trained? Her fiancé is a captain.
You're absolutely right, my friend, but this was written by Willett Huntington Wright.
Are you saying that the fact that the writer was a terrible, horrible sexist is evidence in this murder case?
Yes.
Okay, I can't argue with that. I'm done here. What am I supposed to do with this?
Now, the thing is, right, I am very excited to see where this novel goes from here. Because so far, it has not thrown any suspicion the way of the major other than saying that the brothers did not get along and having him show up and having him being the first character mentioned in the story. And, this list is getting surprisingly long, Ben. Shall I keep going?
I mean, if you want to, really.
And having him call Markham and ask him to assist in the crime, almost as though the legal man would not be very good at using evidence to actually put a case together. He's also... he's also, he's the highest ranked army character in the story. He's got that army cult. There's also the fact that Benson had his clothes off, and if we're assuming that it wasn't the woman, why would Benson get his clothes off for another woman's husband?
That is an excellent question.
And we know that their business as brothers, whilst it was, going well, it seems like they're not the most ethical on the street, and an army major not having strong ethics, either that's a criticism of army majors or... maybe the one who's really pulling the strings in the business has just found himself dead on the chair in his apartment.
Do you think that Wright was a particularly avid opposer of the army, of the American Armed Forces? I think that's something he would be against, being the way we were back in the 1930s, being very patriotic?
I don't know. And the thing is that the story hasn't really done any deconstruction of that role other than that wild guess that I've just thrown there.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I'm feeling incredibly confident about this one.
Fair enough.
And I'm excited to see how this evidence comes around. I have a feeling that Fife is going to be in character very similar to either Leacock or Benson in that Benson has found someone else to frame. So it'll be interesting to see how he appears as a character. But, that's left up for the story so far.
Yeah, I guess we'll have to see what happens.
Indeed we will.
I do find interesting that we haven't really seen, we've got the murder, but we don't have any particular puzzles. I mean, we have, how did they get into the house? But other than that, I don't feel like there's been any, any more complicated, there's no, they were in the boat, and how did they get to the boat, and where were you at this time? It's kind of fluid for now.
Well,
I don't know if there's any puzzles you want to poke at particularly.
Technically, the murder was a locked room puzzle, but that is entirely gotten rid of by saying that Platts let them in. But you're right. There are very few puzzles going on here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think if there are any others really. I think kind of the main puzzle is the fact that all of the evidence seems to be pointing away from the person that I'm saying it is, as the police seem to think. And not to say that I am on some lofty higher plane like Philo Vance thinks he is.
You like to believe that you are, but
the story very clearly is trying to lead you in the same way as the police.
Sure.
But Herds, I've been speaking for a while here.
You have. You've been enjoying...
You are stewing on the other side of the table with unrivaled confidence. I've never seen you come to a case with such determination to defeat me as I see across from the table now.
Look, I've just been letting you go on and on because you enjoy the sound of your own voice, clearly.
That is true.
That's why you talk so much. But I'm here to tell you that you are in fact incorrect, sir.
Incorrect.
The major is entirely out of the picture. I don't know why you would fall for such a clever ruse on the part of Mr. Wright here. So
okay, I'll let this play out.
So here's the thing. I think that the rule that you're referencing in terms of cutting out particularly the policemen who are assisting in the case is number 11. Characters such as the butlers, footmen, valets, gamekeepers, cooks, and the like must not be chosen by the author as a culprit. There is nothing explicitly about the policeman, and most importantly, the Watson character, which we could argue is maybe Van Dyne themselves.
Are you trying to say that our perspective? Are we breaking Knox's rule that we cannot follow the thoughts?
No.
Okay.
No, I'm not saying that Van Dyne is the culprit because they wrote the books, and that wouldn't make any sense. But you know what does make sense?
That would be a good twist, though.
That would be an excellent twist. I'm sad that I didn't come up with that one. But Markham. Markham is nothing but helpful and has been here since the very beginning. It's one of the first characters to be introduced in the novel when he comes to Philo Vance's door. And I want to pose the theory that his plan is to create a mystery that Philo Vance can't actually solve, and to prove to him that police work is harder than he thinks it is. That this is all not just fun and games, but it's easy to let the culprit slip through your grasp. So I think that Markham has done the deed, and this whole thing saying that Major Benson called it up, maybe that's true, maybe that's not, but that's just a cover.
Okay.
That's how I feel about it.
Now, the angle that I'm taking, you're absolutely right. I have created my own interpretation of Rule 11, which I'm sure Willard Huntington Wright would be very upset with me about.
He's stewing in his grave right now because you are thinking that Major Benson is the one.
I'm sure.
Clearly
I'm
not.
sure. Van Dyne's rules are less about fair play in the same way that Knox's rules were, and more about creating a good story.
Mm-hmm.
And thus, I think you can kind of flex the interpretations a bit. See what I did there?
Mm-hmm.
To,
I heard that.
that hurt. That hurt.
Awful.
Now,
Yes?
I think that what I'm doing by interpreting the rule and saying that the police can't be involved is that it doesn't lend anything really to the credibility of the story for the police. You know, let's just say that everyone in the police department is a suspect. Suddenly, all of our evidence is absolutely naught.
But not just any policeman. It's Markham. It's Markham who's like looking after it from the inside.
Technically,
the
you're
guy
right.
who brought us on the case. He's with us every step of the way. He's in every single scene we go in.
Yeah, technically, you're right.
Having conversations with the other policemen slightly off screen. I'm just saying.
He is the district attorney. And
he is.
You know, now that I think about
There's even a note in the book that says that the district attorney is like no longer the attorney by the time of the sixth book. I
his
think.
willing stupidity, at least as far as Philo Vance is concerned, would actually make sense if he's just trying to lead Philo Vance down a wild goose chase.
Yeah, he's failing horribly, but he's trying. And he knows that Philo Vance is actually on his case. That's why it's called the Benson case.
I'm thinking, it sounds like rubbish.
So that note, right? Earlier in the book, talk about how the district attorney, it's a shame that they're no longer the district attorney.
How are you turning this on its head?
This is foreshadowing for 6 books. You know how we wrote 6 books in a row?
Oh, no.
This is foreshadowing for the 6th book when the district attorney is finally out as being the mastermind of all of these crimes.
So you think this is all some big scheme over the next 6 books?
This is why Van Dyne or Will Wright is so well regarded, because he wrote this 6-book, I don't know what that is, not a trilogy, a hexology? Who even knows?
Sounds right.
Hexology. He wrote this hexology with Markham, the Watson character, being secretly the killer from the very beginning. And that's how it plays out. Dude, that's it.
The thing is, I don't believe you because that sounds so good.
That would be fantastic. Somebody write that. I mean...
Thank you for writing that, Will Huntington Wright.
Good work, Van Dyne. You did it.
Ugh.
I'm just saying.
You know, oh, man.
Markham would be the perfect culprit for this novel.
The thing is there's a lot of clues I think that you're letting slide in there.
No, I'm not. The only clue that could throw out the window if he's secretly a woman dressing as a man, but that's, a whole other thing.
I don't even think that's true. I think that what you've done then is said that every clue is an intentionally laid red herring, which is, mind you, foreshadowed by that discussion between Philo Vance and Markham.
By Markham. Markham's the one.
Is nonetheless, a very, very long draw of one's long bow.
And where are we in the world? England. That's where the longbow's from, and that's where we are. Inspired by. See, I made it come all the way back around. We're inspired by England detective fiction because they had the longbow. That's what they're known for. And they're over in the Battle of Agincourt.
Hurts.
Shout out to history.
You know, this is one of the few times that I've come away from one of your theories, aside from, non-mystery theories, where I've been thinking to myself, I wish I was wrong.
I wish
I was wrong.
Where's the fishing hook in this story? We need one of those. Where's the old man to scale the walls of the apartment?
Maybe that's what Markham did.
And take
he
the shot
climbed up and shot an army colt through the iron bars.
That's it. Dude, there was a gun on the mantelpiece and it was loaded for some reason because, Benson likes his guns loaded. And then the old man came up outside and pulled
I wasn't an army colt. I was a 38.
Doesn't matter.
Smith & Wesson.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, it was a 45 army colt.
It doesn't matter.
Your theory is falling apart.
Shush you.
What chapters are we doing next episode?
We are doing chapters 9 to 18, so we're on a long stretch. But I promise you the chapters are slightly shorter than the current one, so it should even out. Should all even out perfectly. The end of chapter 18. We'll see you all on Death the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour.
And that was part 1 of the extended cut for the Benson and Kennel murder case by S.S. Van Dyne. We are Flex and Herds. This is Death of the Reader, your Murder Mystery World Tour on 2SER. And it's time to jump over to part 2 of the Benson murder case, where we covered chapters 9 to 18.
Yeah, we'll be seeing a little bit more into the process of the detective, seeing how Vance really sniffs out a criminal. And maybe we'll see a bit of his humane side.
Maybe. We'll also get to see some suspects who really just have no idea how to make themselves seem innocent, and it wastes a lot of our time, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, well, Maybe the thing that we learned is it's all about the loved ones we made along the way.
I completely agree. I completely agree. This is the extended cut. We are talking the Benson murder case, chapters 9 to 18. Enjoy. You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER. We are Flex and Hertz bringing you your Murder Mystery World Tour, and we are back with the Benson murder case.
The most exciting hip-hop happening, newspaper article running murder case this side of America, I guess.
I
We're still here.
So. I'm having so much fun with this story.
I'm glad.
It's absolutely right up my alley. Our detective, Philo Vance, is completely and utterly insufferable.
Yeah.
But, hey, that's just how it is.
Isn't that like the biggest draw of the novel? It's certainly the most interesting thing going on, in my opinion.
I don't think if you were going to read all 12 Philo Vance novels that you'd be able to survive.
I couldn't imagine doing that. That would actually kill a man.
But for just one or two of them, it's amazing.
Yes. I'm perfectly happy to dip in and see what Vance is doing and see how he can, apparently pinpoint the suspect in 5 minutes, but then not say anything about it for the next, week? How many days are we into this thing?
There are dates at the start of each of the chapters, but I don't think that changes at all how utterly insufferable the man is.
Sure.
Like, let's look at, the early part of, we're discussing chapters 9 to 18 today.
Yep.
And one of the early things that happens in this section of the book is he sits down and he has a discussion with Miss Platts, the housekeeper of our murder victim, Alvin Benson. And he just manages to woo her in such a short amount of time.
He's such a lovely man, as well established by the previous scenes.
His supposed pleasantness puts her at enough ease to be able to break through the lies that she's been telling for the previous 8 chapters, just because he's such a nice guy.
I think the idea is that he's supposed to be so psychologically adept that he can put on a front and, he can examine her and he can see, she's twitching her fingers. That means I had to move myself. I had to move my body in this direction to seem more welcoming. But it's just ridiculous coming from Vance, who we kind of hate at this point.
Yeah, one thing that I know from doing a bit of research on how, body language works in these kind of cases, because I was fascinated as to how it would apply with this story, is that body language, you can see what's happening, but there are so many possible meanings to the signals that you're seeing that it's like voodoo to try and suggest that you would be able to know exactly what's going on. But that seems to be what Vance can do.
He's just so good at it.
He's just perfect at everything.
He's the perfect detective in every way. He's wealthy. He's a good chatter. He knows how to psychoanalyze the local maid staff.
Yep. Here's the thing, is that if we were going to start getting into character flaws later down the line, like if through the remaining 11 books in this franchise, it was going to be that here's Vance at his absolute most perfect, and then book 2, we start to see those flaws come out.
Appear.
Book 3, and it starts to crumble, and he has to slowly rebuild his character.
He turns into a cop on the edge.
I will wager money that is not what is going to happen.
No, it doesn't seem like it. Wright's perspective is of this sporting event between the detective and the criminal. And I don't think that he would care about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one thing is with Willard Wright's rules, which we discussed a bit this week, and there's a discussion on the podcast for a bit more detail going through all 20 of them. But basically, as you say, it's all about the game of detective culprit. And anything getting in the way of that, rubbish.
Irrelevant.
Get it out of here. Throw it away.
Throw it in the bin. Yeah.
That said, though, I do think that the Benson murder case does inadvertently make a fairly effective deconstruction of the genre as a whole without making it seem like one, which I think is actually really appealing.
I'd love to hear you explain that, because that's not quite the expression that I got, but I'd love to hear about that.
Well, basically, Philo Vance's approach to detecting and Willard Wright's approach to writing and S.S. Van Dyne's approach to being a character or
not being a character. Nobody addresses him at any scene, I don't think.
It's fantastic.
It's awful.
But all of those things, every time that they're discussing how things are done, they're always talking about things that, the police do or detectives do. And every single one of them is from another murder mystery.
Yeah.
Like some of them, they mention explicitly who it's from. Some of them they don't. But I really like the way that the story goes, well, here's this trope. It's rubbish.
Yeah.
Here's an alternative.
Yes.
Like there's this moment where Vance sits down and he says that the whole thing of assuming that someone is guilty because of the way that they move around is rubbish, because they could be more guilty because they think they're going to go to prison for something they didn't do.
That is definitely, I see what you're getting at now. That is one of the kind of highlights of the novel, that Vance, when, Markham, who may or not be the culprit himself anyway, we'll get to that, is running around trying to just find somebody to accuse because, you see, I have found that they were in this location at the exact time, therefore they had the opportunity, therefore we should convict them. And Vance is like, no, maybe stay your hand, sir. Maybe we see all of the clues of this case. I do like that that's something that thought is being put into. We're not just grabbing someone out of the blue and say, you are the culprit because of these flimsy reasons. We can definitely see, even if Vance is insufferable, even if Mr. Wright is a little bit insufferable in his writing, he knows what he's talking about.
Absolutely. And I mean, that's one of the things that the rules do cover, is that there's a whole bunch of tropes in there that he just says, this is why I think this doesn't work. And even though I disagree with a lot of them, he obviously has seen them and has an approach, which I think is totally fair.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think there is another writer like Wright in the genre. And that's awesome. Of course, the other thing about them being insufferable and old-fashioned is the relationships and character dynamics in this novel are, not to say non-existent, but almost openly not there. Like, there's this moment in chapter 10 where Markham and Vance are having this discussion and, ridiculing each other for what they think. And Van Dyne makes the comment that,
I had always noticed in the relationship of these two men that whenever either made a remark that bordered on generosity, the other answered in a manner which ended all outward show of sentiment. It was as if they wished to keep this more intimate side of their mutual regard hidden from the world.
like, obviously it's a bit old-fashioned. Oh, we can't be getting close with our male friends or whatever. But like, I do like the way that there's still a dynamic there, but at the same time, it's like, come on, they clearly have such an interesting dynamic in terms of how they operate, and the story refuses to ever let it do anything other than just be them arguing.
Yeah. A lot of it is Van Dyne kind of telling us about these relationships, and I think that's also stated of like the other characters in the novel that supposedly have relationships with each other. It's a lot of hearsay. We don't really get a lot of these. Like in a lot of most modern fiction, we have these scenes where the characters, they sit down and they talk to each other, and that, those talky scenes are how we get to know the characters. We only really see Markham and Vance talking in this novel. I wonder. I guess that's part of Wright's philosophy that, nothing should get in the way of the case. We shouldn't be worrying about the inner working lives of these people except for what we can use as evidence, right? Like when we want to grab someone and learn about their relationship with someone else, we take them into a room and we interrogate them, right? We don't, have a cutaway and see that scene being played out.
I thought it was really fascinating the way that this novel starts to feel very much like an early video game RPG.
Yes.
Where everyone has their point that their character rotates around in the 3D space of the world, and you just show up and you can interact with them, and and it's only when the quest item happens that they actually go anywhere else.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they call Fife in particular. They call to the office 3 times, I think.
Yeah.
Like, what are these characters doing outside of the case? Do they do anything?
Well,
do
that's
they have
really
lives?
fascinating to me. Is that they're always going to these culture clubs, and
Yes!
I know that that's a part of history. But is there anything else they do in their
What
week?
do they do? Do they eat? Do they sleep? Who knows?
Yeah, I'd be very interested to find out how much 20th century club culture was actually what people did in the week, or if it's maybe just that we're dealing with a slightly more upper class, so they don't have jobs.
I mean, that's a good point, isn't it? That's what we get back to the aristocracy. It's all coming back. But yeah, I think that it's Wright's, it's his play to say these characters are well off. They don't have anything to do. I mean, that's why Vance is on this adventure to begin with. He said, I have all the time in the world and all the money, and I collect art, and I don't get up before noon. Bring me on a case. A murder. That sounds like fun.
Yep. It's very silly. I mean, one of the other things in terms of this novel's suspending disbelief is that despite all of Van Dyne's rules, and these are the tropes you want to avoid, he still does that goddamn trope of people going, oh yeah, no, I was doing this. I wasn't here. I was over there. And they're obviously lying, but that the truth makes them seem more innocent than they lie.
Yes.
So why are they doing it? And the story, as we were saying, like with it addressing the tropes of the genre, does kind of play off that a little bit. But this whole thing where Miss Platts is like, oh yeah, Muriel was here 6 hours before the crime. Like, why wouldn't you just say that?
She was protecting her tea buddy. You can't turn in your tea buddy's feelings. If you ever had a tea buddy, it's a bond of trust.
Here's the thing, is that if she just told them, she would have made herself seem more innocent and St. Clair. But because she lied, now she and St. Clair are suspicious. Like, it frustrates me so, Herds. It frustrates me so.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the many fun, somewhat insufferable tropes of murder mystery where all the characters are lying, but it's not necessarily because they killed a person. Not necessarily. Though it may also just be that they killed a person.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe they all killed a person.
There's always the standard excuses as to why people do it, and it's one of the things in this genre you just have to kind of go along with.
Yeah.
But I was really hoping that someone like Van Dyne would be the exception.
Sure.
And he let me down.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one of his other novels does that a bit better. But, I mean, you can imagine if everybody just told the truth. Although you do have puzzles like that, where you're given 3 statements that said, Susie, Mary, and Jane have these 3 things about what color dresses they prefer. One of them always tells the truth and one of them always lies. Those are great puzzles. I don't know if you can make a murder mystery out of that, but I'd love to see someone give it a shot.
I mean, I suppose. I do get what you're getting at. And yes, you absolutely could make an interesting puzzle out of that. But like the way that you'd present that in the story in an authentic way without it just coming across as like a children's playbook would be the difficult part.
That would be the difficult part.
One of the other peculiar things about this entire story has been that despite it being entirely built off, Vance's understanding of psychology and body language, so many of the interviews we get with various characters don't actually show any body language or interaction at all. The first one that we get where an interview describes any amount of body language where Vance isn't the one doing the interview is when Markham interviews Captain Leacock in like chapter 10 or 11.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really strange that a story so banking on the merits of psychology and psychoanalysis would just forsake what it's trying to uphold.
There's a whole lot of Vance saying, but you shouldn't forget the psychological aspect, but he doesn't do that. Like, he doesn't really go deep into it as much as I'd like. I don't know. I thought it was funny that one of the first things that he does to really push the investigation along is try to establish the height of the murderer, which, like, how relevant that actually is, who knows. But I just found it very amusing that he's always saying, you can't rely on the material evidence. You can't focus on who was here and who was where. You have to look at the real, the thinking behind the case, behind the murder. Now let's go use maths to establish how tall this person is. Like, what does that have to do with the psychological aspects, Vance? What's happening?
The other problem that I have with that entire determining the height of the culprit thing is that it so obviously has so many holes in it. Like, first of all, we're assuming that Hagedorn knows exactly what, which, I mean, I guess from the...
But he's a firearms expert or a ballistics expert. He knows everything.
As I was going to say, I can let that slide. Like, that's okay. Then there's the whole thing of... assuming that the culprit is standing with a perfect, aim down the sight, range firing perspective when he's specifically saying at the same time that they had to draw it quickly so as not to arouse suspicion.
Yep.
Like, these two aspects seem mutually exclusive to me. And then there's, it makes so many assumptions and breaks so many of its own assumptions within its own internal logic.
They assume that the killer didn't just, flick their wrist and try and curve the bullet around,
And here's the thing, is I know it's going to be right in the end because it's Van Dyne. And it's the way it reads.
Yeah.
But, not to mention, have we actually gotten the height of any character other than Vance in this entire novel?
I don't think we have, not in numbers. See, here's the thing. If there was a bit at the start where there were like little markings on the wall showing, if there was like Vance, up against the wall making markings whenever walked through the door frame to like establish the height of characters, maybe that would make sense. None of that. Throw that out the window.
That would actually be pretty funny.
That'd be pretty funny.
I do.
That would really humanize Vance. I'm just saying. Oh my goodness.
Something really silly like that. I guess while we're talking about, the possible culprits and before we get into the actual discussion in the final part of the show about who we think it is, I do find it very interesting the way that we start to deal with the Major and his involvement with the crime. Because so far he's not really under suspicion, even though I think it's him.
He's been hardly in the story. He's barely even a character.
No, he's more in the story than the other suspects. Don't even try me.
All right.
But the thing that I find really interesting is looking at his psychology and the way that he reacts, because there seems to be so much back and forth with him about who he's okay with being found guilty. Like, initially it seems like he's pushing for St. Clair, and then suddenly they turn around and they go, oh, well, it's probably Captain Leacock. And he's like, oh, no, could be Captain Leacock. He's a great guy. Just don't worry about him. And then it gets to Leander Fife, and they don't really have anything to go on. And he's like, "Oh yes, no, Leander Fife. Interesting choice. He's a bit of a lowlife, isn't he?
Bit of a rotten egg."
And then suddenly it turns out that it couldn't really be Fife. So he's like, "Oh yeah, I mean, I guess it could be Leacock. I mean, he was seen, with a gun under the bridge. And what is going on with the man?
I don't know. Maybe he's the killer, or maybe he's just a man caught up in events beyond his control. Who knows?
It's very peculiar." One might even assume that he could be guilty.
I would never suspect such a thing of the Major. He's an upstanding army guy, or was.
The reason I bring this all up and the reason I accuse the Major here is that I really do like the way that we're going through our possible suspects, the way that we're pointing at each of them and saying, like, well, here's all of the interesting aspects that make them possible, and slowly kind of making each of the possibilities tick off the list as that's not reasonable, that's not reasonable, that's not reasonable. And the pace at which we're doing it is really nice, to the point where I think that if you didn't know about Van Dyne's rules, you could be pointing in any direction right now in the story, and I really like that.
Yeah, it's very well done.
Either way, right now it's time to chat with Daniel McMahon, and we'll be back just after that with a discussion of who we think the culprit is, Herds.
Who could it be? It could be anyone.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. This is Flex and Herds on the air with Mr. Daniel McMahon, writer and voice talent for the game LA Noir, created by Australian game developers Team Bondi. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me, Flex.
Now, a bit of a free question to start off. As part of the writing team for LA Noir, what kind of mystery stories and crime fictions do you see most reflected in your written adaptations of crime and noir?
The most fascinating thing about LA Noir, which has been out in the press for a while, is that almost all of the stories in it were based on real newspaper material gathered from our extensive archive that we kept. We had a copy of the LA Examiner and the Herald Express for every day from December 1946 through January 1948.
I'm impressed that they kept that all archived. Honestly.
Yeah, I wasn't there for the very early stages where they went around Los Angeles. The production crew went around just pillaging film studios and archives and those sorts of things. But we had all of these binders of newspaper material, and it was all scoured and collected and put into a big database where we could, cross-reference it by murder weapon and by suspect and by location within the city. So as weird and wonderful as the stories in LA Noir get, and as convoluted as the mysteries get, they're all true. The very first case in LA Noir where a man's car is discovered in a rail yard completely drenched in blood. Yeah. And then,
human blood, of course.
Well, no. The detectives discover the. So you've played.
I have played it. I played it with my mother. Long story.
Fantastic.
Let's keep it on you.
No, fantastic. Well, one of the things we learned about LA Noir was that it was a very, very good couch game. It was the equivalent of watching seasons of television.
Yeah, it definitely has a very movie vibe.
Yeah, very
following
much.
The characters around and the interrogations, the camera cutting back and forth between the suspect and the interrogator and that sort of thing.
That story of the man's car being discovered completely drenched in blood and the butcher's receipt found in his trunk, and it turning out that he had splashed pig's blood all over his car in order to leave his wife and run away with his mistress is completely true. It was in the newspapers in 1947. It was followed in the sort of salacious way that these sort of newspaper stories will be, and that wasn't even the craziest of it. There were other weirder things. People running down streets, shouting religious obscenities and lashing people with whips. Weirdness. weirdness. It was a very violent time, which is
fantastic.
What gives rise to that whole noir atmosphere.
Is that your favorite case in the game, or was that your favorite sort of piece of inspiration, or do you have another that you particularly enjoy?
Well, I really enjoyed the homicide desk. As you know, in the game, your character moves on is eventually promoted to work the homicide desk, the very prestigious homicide desk within the LAPD. And all of those murder cases that are portrayed in LA Noir are true. There was considerable stink over whether the real names of the victims could be used. That went back and forth so many times that honestly, I could not tell you right now what the characters in the game ended up.
That's fair enough.
That's pretty funny.
But the thing that's fascinating to me about it is that all of those cases are real. They culminate in references to the murder of Elizabeth Short, the famous case of the Black Dahlia. LA Noir posits a fictional serial killer who's responsible for all of those murders, and obviously, in the game you have to be able to confront that killer and blow their head off like any good video game.
Of course.
What else would you do?
In real life, those murders continued all the way into 1948, and one of the later victims was a woman by the name of, if I'm remembering it correctly, Geneva Hilliker, who is the mother of the famous neo-noir author James Ellroy. If you've ever wondered why James Ellroy is such a weird and wild and damaged person, it's because his mother was a murder victim in mid-40s Los Angeles and, suffered at the hands of the man who killed Elizabeth Short, who, as we know, was never caught.
Yeah. I was doing a little bit of research on that. There were some thoughts that he was kind of projecting the unresolved emotions from his mother's murder when he was 10 years old. Reports in the Times say that his first reaction was, oh, well, good, I get to live with my father. But the fact that he continues to write about the Black Dahlia murder, I feel like there's more to it than that. There's some emotion there. There's some things that he's trying to move forward through writing.
Absolutely. The Black Dahlia of the LA Quartet, as it's called, which starts with the Black Dahlia, that is an extraordinary book because it is exactly as you say, basically a love letter and a hate letter to his absent mother, and the emotions that the two detectives in that book go through in, struggling to process what's happened to this woman. Yeah, for sure. I imagine are the same ones he went through. So,
Dan, what are some of the difficulties you found when attempting to adapt a murder mystery to video game format?
Well, first I should say that I was not I was a staff writer on LA Noir. I was not the primary writer, so all the credit for the wonderful drama in that script goes to Brendan McNamara, who was the writer-director of the game. But the difficulties that he experienced, and certainly I experienced as well, just to move more broadly to video games for a second, I think the problem of adapting murder mystery to video games makes you kind of confront a distilled version of all the problems of video games, right? You have all the problems of player agency, you have all the problems of sequential action, you have all the problems of when to present information to people and what they have access to and what they can do. We had all of these glorious plans in LA Noir to make it a true open world detective game. But, you're kind of in direct conflict when, as we know from crime fiction, the entire art and artistry of crime fiction is what order you present the clues. And the very, very skillful doling out of clues is basically the entire morbid appeal of crime fiction. So how do you reconcile that with a video game where ideally you should be able to find whatever you like and speak to whoever you like and say whatever you like to them?
Yeah, I think that it was a very impressive feat to attempt to create an open world like that. The game that I always come back to when I think about murder mystery fiction, it's what got me interested in the genre to begin with. Not a novel. I know this is heresy to many, but it was a video game by the name of The Last Express. It was made or released in 1997. Have you heard of it? Have you?
I have heard of it. I've not played it.
Oh, it's a real gem. It's a bit rough, but it's a gem.
It's John Mechner, right? It's the Prince of Persia guy.
Yes, that is exactly who it is. The thing about The Last Express was that it came out in 1997, but the studio was going bankrupt at the time. So the first team to go was the marketing department. That's why nobody has heard of it or played it. But it's anyway. We might do an episode on this game at some point. I'd love to. But the kind of the way that the team decided to get around these problems of agency and, as you say, time and presenting clues sequentially, is that the game is constricted to a very narrow play area. There are only 4 cars in this train that the game set on the Orient Express. There are these 4 cars that set on, and the actors or the characters in the game, they run on a schedule. So the clues in the game that you can run across will only happen at certain times. And if you're not in there at that time, then you'll miss the conversation completely. You'll miss those clues. And these can lead to bad ends and bad things happening and having to restart the whole game because you missed an event. And that's totally fine. The game has a rewind mechanic.
Wow.
So that's how they kind of tried to address that issue. Although it does become tedious because it works on a checkpoint system and you can't save the game. So you sometimes have to rewind like an hour of gameplay time to find the one thing that you missed.
Sure.
But I find it fascinating.
Absolutely, it's fascinating. It's such an elegant solution to the problem of open world video game geography to literally set your game in a corridor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty
Big
much.
corridor that with wheels that rolls along.
Absolutely.
rolls along track.
Yes, it's fascinating.
But obviously we didn't have that luxury in LA Noir because we had the entirety of Los Angeles to explore. And the other part of it is part of the difficulty, and again, it's a distillation of general video game problems, is when I'm playing video games, I hate missing out on conversations like that. I hate missing out on bits of the story. It makes me feel as though I'm not, this might just be my loyalty to literature and film speaking, but I hate to feel as though I'm missing out on parts of the story. And certainly in LA Noir, something that we had a lot of difficulties with is making sure that people had all of the clues from a particular crime scene that they needed to, literally continue on through the case. We had a big problem with people being able to dead end themselves. One of the design decisions on LA Noir was that people should not be able to dead end themselves either in conversation or in their investigation. And it sounds as though The Last Express, you can.
You can absolutely. Some of the best moments in the game, though, are when you dead end yourself. There's one particular moment I'm thinking of late towards the end of the game where you seem to have solved a deadly problem, and a man says, "Let's go get some tea." And if you go to that man and have tea with him because you've missed all the other signs that there's more problems on the train, you'll just die. It will just completely destroy you. And it's a quite humorous moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that also reflects older style video game design where it was a lot more about just going at it again and again and again until you had that perfect run.
For sure.
And I think the other part of it is as a writer or a reader, you have to reach a place of equanimity with the fact that some people may not get the best version of your story. Which is a very difficult place to get to. I think when you've worked so hard, particularly when it comes to murder mystery and crime fiction, when you've worked so hard to put together all the moving pieces of your plot, it's terribly frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always put out there as the best feature of crime fiction and particularly murder mystery is that you can read it again in second time and it's basically a different book because you see all the clues looking out in front of you. Do you think that that's a similar experience in how you can present it in video games, or would that just not gel in terms of people trying to make so many different actions on a replay?
Ideally, we want to move towards this place where the replay value in a video game murder mystery is that you can come closer and closer to the truth each time. Unfortunately, in a game like LA Noir, I don't know. There's plenty more conversation to be had. There's plenty more freaky digital faces to look at.
Yeah.
But the fact that we had to bring so much back to that kind of linear path means that perhaps the replay value was damaged. But it's a wonderful dream to have this sort of, it sounds like The Last Express might be something more in line with that there is more conversation to be found, more character to be found, and perhaps the replay value in the thing is that on a single playthrough you may not solve the crime. I think that's really interesting.
Now, Daniel, our author this week, Mr. Van Dyne, is plagued with a force of egoism that drives the portrayal of his detective. Another author comes to mind who you've mentioned, Mr. James Ellroy, once dubbing himself both the greatest crime novelist who ever lived and the demon dog with the hoglog. Now, have the works of this man influenced your experience of noir detective fiction?
Absolutely. I'm a big fan, not just because of LA Noir. I think I'd been a reader of James Ellroy before because, like a lot of people, I saw LA Confidential, that completely wonderful Curtis Hanson, Brian Helgeland film, which, if you ask me, actually improved on the book in a great many ways. I think that script is just an absolute masterpiece of adaptation. To take everything that's in that book and distill it down into those 3 beautifully interwoven stories and strands, and not just that, but to interweave so beautifully those 3 protagonists. Bud White and Ed Exley and Jack Vincennes. Although, I mean, it is a little bit sad that film has now been damaged by the Kevin Spacey scandal, isn't it? But yes, certainly LA Confidential was my introduction to James Ellroy. Having been through the entirety of the LA Quartet, I think my favourite is probably The Big Nowhere, which is the 3rd book in that series, because again, it has such wonderful detective characters. It's another one where I believe there's 3 protagonists, and well, it wouldn't give too much away if I was to say, now that I've said that there's 3 protagonists, the suicide of one of those detectives in The Big Nowhere is one of the most amazing scenes I've ever read, not just in Ellroy, like in crime fiction anywhere. And I think it's the pure sort of language and impact that man writes with that gives it such power. There's by the time it gets to White Jazz, people talk about White Jazz as like the Finnegan's Wake of crime fiction, because he basically invents an entirely new language. Big Nowhere for me is enough towards, the more demonstrative style where you can actually figure out what's going on, and blended with that kind of, jazz rhythm of very staccato language, that it achieves a really beautiful balance point with a really strong story as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the strong suits of James Ellroy's writing compared to Van Dyne, who we're covering this week, where Van Dyne has a set of rules where he says that we shouldn't dilly-dally with atmospheric passages, but James Ellroy goes to show where the strengths in those atmospheric passages and those emotions coming through in the text, rather than just the hardline puzzle, can be so valuable to the story as a whole.
Yeah. The story that Brendan was an enormous fan of James Ellroy, the story he liked to tell about him was, and I don't know whether this is true, but it's a great story, was that
It's the best.
was that James Ellroy was being taken to task so thoroughly by his editor one day for the length of his manuscript that he just went through and took all the verbs out.
I have also heard that story, so perhaps
which
there
is brilliant.
truth.
There's a grain of truth in there, I'm sure.
As far as we're concerned, Flex, it's true.
Van Dyne advocates strongly, as I said, for mystery, which is hardline the puzzle. We don't dilly-dally with atmospheric passages, and he always wants for there to be a conclusion at the end. But James Ellroy always seems to have this debunking of the myth where he will leave stories hanging. How do you think that the open-ended story can fit in the world of detective and crime fiction when there's so much of a pull for people to have, a satisfying ending?
That's really interesting, actually. I've not been reading too much crime fiction recently, but one of the more recent ones that I read was The Dry, Jane Harper's The Dry, which is a very well-regarded and very famous Australian crime novel. And I thought that was wonderful in its atmosphere and its themes, the idea of an Australian farmer being found having, shot himself and his family in his house is so, and detectives having to try and figure that out is just so wonderfully thematic and feels so noirish and whatever. And then I was quite disappointed with how conventionally the whodunit of that book played out. That, you met a cast of characters, they all had their various motivations and things, and then, the conclusion was, convincing enough. I knew why the character whodunit had done it, but it seemed so, it did not seem to make the most of the promise to simply say, that guy did it.
Yeah.
Instead of using that amazing atmosphere and that amazing, thematic stuff that had been built up. So it's really interesting. This is just my preference and my bias, obviously, because I've talked about how much I love James Ellroy and his detectives whose lives completely fall apart before your eyes while they happen to try to solve crimes. I am completely fine with the notion of a mystery that isn't solved, a crime that isn't, where justice is not done. Because I think in some of the greatest works of literature, justice is never done.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, it's certainly true to life, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we were speaking several weeks ago with Simon Brett, who's the head of the Detection Club in the UK, which was originally founded by people like Agatha Christie and all of her friends.
Cool.
And basically
They must have great tea parties.
Oh, they did. They did. But basically he was saying that originally it was a very tight-knit group that said only detective fiction, only this way. But in the years since, it's had to open its gates to greater crime fiction. And I think that the way that you say that you respond to these texts and the way that you're satisfied with an ending where the culprit isn't caught very much reflects why they've had to open those gates.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's when you mention Agatha Christie, the thing that comes to mind for me is, what's the policy on spoilers in our crime fiction?
Well, tell us the story first, and we'll debate.
I'm only referring to the end of her, the resolution of her most famous novel, Murder on the Orient Express, which is
I haven't read that, so
Yeah,
no, that's fine.
Spoilers.
We won't
spoilers for
spoil
that
it.
one,
We
sir.
won't spoil it.
Don't
but
you dare. You come on my show and you spoil my mystery novel.
it was the butler. The butler. Always the butler.
What have you done?
But in the case of, it wasn't actually the butler. In the case of Murder on the Orient Express, I think one of the things that makes it so well regarded is not just the unbelievable atmosphere of the setting, murder mystery on a train. Now, all murder mysteries happen on trains, it seems.
It's very good.
But the conclusion of that book, of who actually done it, is very, very unusual and much more pursues pathos and metaphor than it does, satisfying conclusion. It is much more, I would suggest, a resolution of feeling than a resolution of plot.
Well, now we have to do it on a future episode. My goodness. Well, you're listening to Death of the Reader. This was Flex and Herds with Daniel McMahon. Thank you for chatting with us today, sir.
No, thank you very much for having me. That was lots of fun.
It was excellent.
We'll be back in just a second with more on the Benson murder case.
You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SCR, where Flex and Hertz, finally aiming at the heart of this case, hunting for the culprit with the precision of a Vance-shaped scalpel. Flex,
Yes.
it's time for your final verdict, your time to pin the tail on the donkey, as it were. How you feeling?
I'm going very well. We are discussing chapters 9 to 18 of the Benson murder case by S.S. Van Dyne, and it is time to talk solutions, as Herds implies. Now, it's a very interesting position we're in.
Yeah, we've just had a confession.
We've
just figured out who the killer is. It
I
was
guess
Lecoq
I was
all
wrong
along.
all along.
Yeah, it was Lecoq.
What a shame.
That bumbling fool.
What a fool.
Who would have thought that he'd be capable of killing, despite being of a military
Would have
background,
thought such a thing.
having a weapon that he's tossed in the river? He has the motive. He has the means. He has the wit, I assume. And he's just confessed.
2.5 suspects right now in the case.
2.5?
Yes.
Who's the half?
The half is Fife.
Oh, I see.
Because we have the Major, we have Lecoq. Both of those two have access to the army cult, which is suspected to be the weapon by one Hagedorn, who I assume to be correct because we are told by the rules of Van Dyne that they are reliable.
Unless they're not.
I'm sorry, Herds. They're reliable.
What?
I went back over the rules again because I was a little confused after last week's ending where you suggested to me that Markham was going to be the Grand Master Schemer.
Which he
at the end
is,
of all of this,
obviously.
which, whilst very entertaining, I realized that the servants rule was in fact separate from the detectives and official investigators rule.
You think that rules Markham out? He's an official investigator, so
I
he
think
can't
it
be the
does.
culprit?
I'm sorry. Now, we have those two suspects, Lecoq and the Major, and we have Leander Fife, who is a lowlife, according to the Major.
Bit of a gambler, yeah.
Bit of a gambler,
according
and
to the
hunts
colonel.
game,
Yeah,
which points at us as he's a good shot,
he is.
has strong wits, but apparently not perfectly strong, which is why I don't suspect him.
Uh-huh.
Um,
On a scale of 1 to 10, his shot is like a 7.
Well, here's the
Needs to
thing,
be an 8 in
is
order to be suspicious.
in the scene where we discuss the gambling of Fife, Vance specifically ends the scene by going, "Oh, goodness, what an excellent, eliminator of suspects Colonel Ostrander was. And everyone else is like, what are you on about, Vance? The only thing of substance that the Colonel said was that he was a gambler, but not a very good one. The only thing of substance.
He did waffle on quite a bit. I think that was his only defining character trait, that he waffled for hours.
Which it made for a decently compelling scene. But as far as assigning a culprit, I think that outright ruled out Fife in my mind, which means that we're stuck with the two military characters, and here we are with a signed confession from one of them.
Yeah.
Now, first of all, we open the scene by saying that there's no legal weight to the signed confession at all, so therefore there is no weight to the confession at all, putting that out on the table. But the thing I find most fascinating about this is that we have the confession of one suspect in the presence of another suspect, while the other suspect doesn't believe that Leacock is actually guilty and is saying so openly.
Yeah.
So, to say nothing of who I think the culprit is in that moment, who made Leacock write the confession?
Why did he write a confession in the first place? Why even bother?
It doesn't make any sense. Like, it has no legal weight. It could be forged. It could have been, written under duress. It wasn't written with a legal notary. All of those things aside, it's incredibly strange.
I mean, we do have the circumstance of the strange telephone call between himself and one Sinclair. You think that might be related?
I mean, I think so. I mean,
I know that Van Dyne says there must be no love in the story, but
my initial suspicion is that Leacock has been told to write the confession with the hopes that he can prove his innocence and avoid the electric chair, because that's the threat that's dangling over us in this murder mystery for our culprit. I don't know why St. Clair would try and convince him to go through that route when surely proving that he's innocent would be easier.
Maybe there's something else going on. You said that a lot of the characters in the story are trying to cover for each other. Mrs. Platts is covering for Sinclair, and various other characters are covering for each other in different ways. Maybe that's what's happening here. Maybe Leacock is trying to protect Sinclair, or somebody else even. Maybe that's what's happening.
My initial reaction to that claim is that we know that there was some business deal going on between the Benson brothers and Leacock and St. Clair that Leacock had come around and was frustrated about, and, clearly something is going on there. My suspicion is that there's some shady backroom deals going on, and they're, operating under the table, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, maybe Leacock is the killer, and he's confessing to avoid Sinclair being dragged into this.
No, I was more saying that perhaps they're trying to avoid their business shady deals being dug up alongside this case.
Maybe.
Which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense either. I don't know. I don't think that we've had enough reasons to see why they'd need to have anything covered that couldn't be covered better by being innocent. So I don't think it makes sense. I'm sure you could drag something out like they're trying to cover for some deal that they're doing, but I don't think that it's worth the approach they're taking.
So you're saying that you don't know? Are you saying that you've given up on why Leacock has come forward?
No, I'm just saying that it doesn't make any sense, which is why I don't suspect him.
Fair enough.
It's my argument for the major that I'm making here, not that I'm trying to avoid making accusations at anyone else.
Fair enough.
Because it's the major. Let's be completely honest.
Why
here.
is the major? I don't understand. All he's done is be helpful this entire novel. He's just kind of showed up every now and then and said, hey, where was this person? They're not doing much. They ain't hurting nobody.
So our evidence with the major is that the culprit must have been a crack shot. The culprit must have had nerves of steel. The culprit must have been someone known and comfortable to Alvin Benson.
Must be about 5'10".
Must have been about 5'10". And we are also told by Benson's secretary that the major has no honor. Which, considering how everyone else in the story talks about him, is extraordinarily suspicious that his closest business connection, his secretary, who deals with all of his dealings, would suspect the man.
You're saying that she knows something more, or that she's...
I'm not saying that they know what's happened. However, we do have that whole discussion of them listening to each other's rooms, clearly not getting along. What is the point of all of that if it isn't relevant?
You think that these strange whisperings, these eavesdroppings on each other? Is there's something funky going on in the business?
Absolutely. I think that whatever is happening, I'm assuming it's some business deal or some, maybe the whole reason that Leacock has written this confession is over a business deal because Sinclair seems to be a business associate that the Major isn't happy with because it's under Sinclair's name. He doesn't know that it's connected to his former, underling in his unit, Leacock, who he seems to have a very high opinion of. So he's basically killed his brother over a business deal with one of his favorite subordinates and has now realized, oh no, I've just lumped suspicion onto my favorite subordinate and is trying to slowly claw his way out of the pit of despair that he's dug himself. And when he pokes his head above the top, suddenly everyone will realize it's the Major. At least that's my theory.
It is an interesting theory. I like it. The Major. He's a good boy, but maybe he's in over his head. Maybe he's not as honorable as most characters might see on the outside. But I want to posit something slightly different to you.
What's that?
Because I think, sir, that you have missed the obvious answer here.
As always.
Because that's just how this show is. You're always missing the obvious.
Always missing the obvious thing.
That's just how it is. It's like your one character trait that everybody remembers.
It's not like I'm the only one with any points on the board.
No. So, I want to posit the theory that, as you say, it has to be one of these army folks. Has to be the Lecoq or Major Benson there.
Or Colonel Ostrander, I suppose.
Or Colonel Ostrander, but he was only there for one scene. I don't think it's fair for me to argue for him at all. But we know that Lecoq has signed this confession, even if it won't hold up in a court of law. It seems like this has been thrown together rather hurriedly. That's the impression that I get. Maybe Lecoq's done the killing and he's realized that all of these business dealings with the Major and Sinclair are coming up, and he's signed this confession. He's trying to bring his own crime to light to keep everybody out of it. To make sure that the police don't come rapping down on the door and drag everyone down with him.
So you are suggesting to me
yes,
that the Major, Sinclair, Alvin Benson, and Leacock are all in some mafioso backroom deal.
Basically.
And that Leacock has been asked to take the fall.
I don't know that he's been asked to take the fall. Maybe he's just doing it because he's a chivalrous good boy. Maybe Major Benson has said yo, don't do that. And Lecoq's like, yo, but I have to.
I see.
This is my duty as a man who loves a woman and has many good friends. He's taken Alvin into the back room and he's plugged around him and he said, I gotta take responsibility for this now. Basically.
I see.
And this isn't a real mafia. Let's be clear. I'm not stepping on Van Dyne's rules here. There's no secret organizations.
Damn, you caught the hole I was about
because
to
I know you were about to say that, and I'm familiar with the rules, sir. I don't know what number it is, but I'm familiar with the rules. But I think that there is a dealing going on between these named characters, and Lecoq has thought, what if we just take Alvin out? Everything will work out fine. Spoilers, it hasn't worked out fine.
Right.
And now he's trying to put everything right. That's what the phone call was about when he was talking to Sinclair. That's why he tried to dump the gun. That's why he sent the confession in. He's trying desperately to say, he didn't want to take the fall, but now he's left with no other recourse.
But if it was this shady backroom deal you suggest, Herds, then why is it that the Major seems to be so keen on pinning the crime on Muriel Sinclair?
Maybe he's not sure. Maybe he doesn't know what's going on.
You think he doesn't know what's going on in his own business?
This is an excellent question. What do we know of any business?
It sounds like your argument is making gymnastics level leaps.
No, it's perfectly reasonable. Lecoq did it. He's trying to take the fall before the good man, Major Benson, gets in trouble. Or Sinclair. There's just this scrabbling going on in the background that we just can't see.
I see.
And that's what you're going to see. When you read through it again, you're going to see this mental battle between, Lecoq and the Major Benson there.
Right. Okay. I can stand by this.
Good. I'm glad.
However, I want to pose to you something slightly different, Herds. Is that I don't think that that's the direction the story is going to go. I reckon in the next chapter or two, we're going to immediately be rid of any suspicion on Captain Leacock.
Well, it is time for the cross-examination.
It is indeed. I suppose that over the last few chapters, we are in fact going to draw more suspicion on Leander Fife. Because we know that it is his car that was seen at the scene of the crime.
It's true.
I don't actually have a particularly great explanation for why that is.
I was about to ask.
I will concede that. I did not spend nearly enough time looking at Leander Fife because I do not think he is involved.
Are you telling me
in a worthwhile way, shape, or form?
Are you telling me that you don't know everything about this story
Absolutely.
by this point?
I absolutely
By the second
do
part
not.
of the story, you don't know everything? Well, that's like minus a billion points, obviously. Come on
Excuse
now. I
you.
expect more of you.
Flex. No, this is unjust. This is unjust. When it comes around to next week and I am proven right, I expect points on my desk by the following morning.
You know what? It's fine. I'll have the little envelope with the signed points document, and then also the document saying that the points are invalid. And whichever one shows up on your desk, you'll know.
Okay,
You'll be there.
That's right. As long as I get the points that I'm owed.
It's true.
Now, I suppose that the two men that we are most likely going to get to is we are going to get to Leander Fife and the Major, because it seems that our discussion is going to end up as who was a crack shot and who had nerves of steel. So far, we have not addressed the cracked shottedness of Captain Leacock, nor the fact that he has any nerves, because apparently he's a good boy that goes to bed at 8 p.m.
He is a very good boy, but also a killer. Also a cold-blooded killer. It's the ones you least suspect.
So I suppose that the final question is going to come down between the Major and Leander Fife. And it's going to be the Major herds.
Well, we'll have to see what happens next time on Death of the Reader.
Yes, we will be going to the end of the Benson murder case, and you can tune in to find out what we're covering next week. This is Death of the Reader on 2SER. Thank you so much for joining us.
We'll see you next time.
And that was part 2 of the Benson murder case here on Death of the Reader by S.S. Van Dyne. We are Flex and Herds. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour. Herds, you seem to have a bit of an interesting theory going into the end of that part there. And I don't know, me having now heard what that theory leads to is a bit suspicious of where that theory is going.
Look, I'm not saying that I was telling any truth, any lies during the last part, but I'm hoping that the rest of you out there have an inkling of who the killer might be laid out on the table at this point in the story.
I think perhaps for once, people might have actually had a better idea what was going on than I did.
Well, if you haven't figured it out, this is the time. Pause the video, the audio clip, have a think about who it might be, check your notes, and we'll see you in part 3.
Yes, we will be discussing chapters 19 to the end. The culprit is revealed, and it's time to enjoy the sweet, sultry tones of jazz with Dr. Christopher Coady.
Oh, beautiful.
This is Death of the Reader's extended cut. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour, and it is the final week of the Benson murder case.
Flex, I can't believe it. You couldn't even figure out who the killer was. You ruined everything. Flex, this was such an easy mystery.
It was a very easy mystery, and I'm proud to be taking my point for this story once again.
Come on.
I got my entire family to read this story along with us, and every single one of them picked the Major by chapter 8. So either my family is all geniuses along with me, or this story is ridiculously easy.
Maybe it's a genetics thing.
Either
Maybe
way,
it's
I get
just
to
your
take credit
family.
for it.
That's fine. Your family can have the points. You can have the points. Shaw can have the points. I'll just sit over here biding my time for the perfect murder case.
It's going to be the story that I offer you like 1,000 points for that you solve, and
Obviously.
then nothing before or after it.
That's how most game shows work, and that's basically what this is.
But yes, we are discussing the Benson murder case by S.S. Van Dyne. It's a wonderful novel set in the early 20th century in New York. With our detective Philo Vance, we are covering chapters 19 to the end of the story, where the culprit has been revealed. It is Major Benson, the brother of the deceased.
Not too many surprises there. He's one of the first characters introduced in the story, which fits with my usual modus operandi. It turns out that the Major was in every scene that he shows up in, pointing fingers at other characters, trying to sway the detective, but he figured out 5 minutes in, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, and that's definitely an interesting point to make, is that Philo Vance comes into this case and supposedly immediately solves it, but then takes 20-plus chapters to actually bother to tell anyone.
Have we mentioned that Philo Vance is the worst?
Utterly insufferable. I thought the strangest thing about this entire novel was that the most human that Philo Vance seemed throughout the entire thing was in the ballistics scene.
Yep.
Where he's describing, how we got from this point to this point and how tall they are, and he's bringing his friends along from the right, and he's like, and you, Markham, how tall do you think the guy is? And you hold the piece of string. And it's a great scene of them all buddy-copping each other.
Yeah.
But then he's just awful to everyone from then on.
Yeah, it's really funny. We kind of talked about this last week, but watching him go from character to character and to every other character, he apparently is just lovely. It's just Markham.
It's so strange.
He loves him, apparently, according to the narration, but they just constantly fighting. And every character who he interviews, he says, that Markham, boy, he's suspecting you. He thinks you're a real dirtbag, but I think you're a good person. He good cops the whole thing, despite being the baddest cop in there.
This was way too much for Markham. The wearing down process of Vance's imitations and veiled innuendos had at last dissipated his self-control. He bent forward and struck the desk angrily with his hand.
So? I was keeping her precious captain locked up, and you were pleading with me to let him go. You know damned well I didn't think either one of them was guilty, you lounge lizard.
And I think the thing that frustrates me most about that is that, as we've said, he has so much room to be a brilliantly self-aware character, but he just doesn't read that way. And there are so many of those moments where he's, playing off these people and intelligently weaving around their psyche to get them to think this thing or the other. But it never feels like that's the way. It just feels like, SS Van Dyne as a socially inept person was writing what he thought a socially competent person was like.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work.
He's very much trying to make up for his own flaws and project and all that fun stuff that writers should never do. But apparently was very successful. I know that audiences this was a very fiscally successful novel. But it's not really that well known now, which is a bit sad.
Yeah, and I mean, we've spoken about a lot of the reasons that I think that is, in that his detective was insufferable, he was set in a very particular period of time where these references would have been relevant, so it doesn't age particularly well in that, even if you exclude the characterization. Yeah. It's also that he came up in a film industry that was still very much being discovered, so even though he might have been the highest selling film of all time, he was the highest selling film franchise of the time, in amongst dozens of other franchises that have also been forgotten.
Yeah, for sure. It's a bit of a shame, but that's okay because we are here to remember him. We will remember
and judge him for character flaws we aren't even certain he had.
Can I, while we're talking about character flaws, we have to talk about Vance's triumphant moment.
Yes.
Arguably the best moment in this entire novel.
Hands down the best moment.
Let's make this clear. The lead up is, they're about to arrest Major Benson, and the narration says, we see Vance pull away from the table slightly. And in my head, I'm thinking, oh, okay, that means he's not going to be there because he's going to be right.
Obviously he's just going to lean back, relax, enjoy himself.
While Benson and the cops, they fight it out because they can probably take him down. There's 4 of them and one of him. Even if he's tough, they'll get through it. But Vance not only escapes harm, but also completely takes him apart. He moves in, grabs him by the arm and dismantles the Major Benson. So not only is he incredibly smart and talented and good looking and wealthy and a psychologist and a good actor and he has lovely friends that are well connected, he's also a ninja.
Yeah. Expert martial artist. If you've seen the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock remakes where we have those cutaways where he's and now I will do this and this and just
pull his person
tears apart the fights. Yeah. I would wager that came from this franchise.
Yes,
that was inspired by the way that scene reads, because that is 1-to-1 right there. And if it was anyone other than Philo Vance, would have loved it.
I was going to say, look, I know I talk about the Robert Downey Jr. movie a lot on this show, but if that had been a Philo Vance movie, I'm just saying, would have made so much sense.
It would have. And maybe it was originally intended to be.
Maybe it was. We'll never know.
You know what else we'll never know, Herds?
Tell me, Flex.
What Leander Fife had to do with anything.
Who's Leander Fife? I've forgotten by this point. Was he a character?
He was the owner of the Cadillac.
Oh, yeah, there was a Cadillac. What was the Cadillac doing there?
Absolutely nothing.
Yeah. This is why when we were going over theories and you were like, oh, that Fife guy, I'll bet we'll get to see more about him and throw more suspicion on him.
No.
Not at all. He's just dropped. Many aspects of this book, he's just dropped.
However, I was right in that Vance was suspecting him as the only second possible culprit.
Yes, this is true.
So I'd gotten that far, even if he didn't actually show up again. He is one of a number of characters in this story who just show up and do absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It's really interesting how this story sets up so many red herrings, but none of them pay off, even though they're answered.
I'd love to talk to Mr. Van Dyne and have a chat with him about what he was thinking, because clearly he's put some thought in this, because he has 6 novels that he wrote at once, but there are several characters. There's Mrs. Anna Platz in particular fascinates me because she has a daughter named Hoffman, who is apparently in the book. Like she's important. She's a secretary. She's part of Platz's like reason for why she was being so shady.
She's the secretary of the victim and culprit.
She's like a huge source of information for the detective to eventually pin the tail on the donkey, but she's not in the list of characters at the start of the book.
No. The edition of the book that we have has a list of characters, which I can only assume comes from Van Dyne himself, because that's the kind of thing it seems like he would do.
Assume so.
But Miss Hoffman has no detail in that character list. When Francis Swacker, which you might be thinking,
who's that? Who's that?
That is Markham's secretary.
Oh my goodness.
Has a character entry, but Hoffman does not, even though she's supposedly one of the main reasons for one of the main suspects, seeming so guilty.
Yeah, it is strange that she is such a background character. I wonder what's going on there, especially when Mrs. Platz, despite not really doing anything, she gets like a whole criminal breakdown during the novel. We have this section of the book where Vance goes into, he's written up this dossier on how Platz would have carried out the crime, the time, the place, the height of the criminal, that sort of thing. And it's all thrown out the window obviously because it's just to, get Markham. But like, it's strange seeing which characters are acknowledged by Vance and by Van Dyne, and which are just ignored.
It is a very elaborate prank too.
It is.
Just like, yes, you district attorney who needs to know exactly what's going on in this case. Here is a joke dossier.
I mean, to be fair, high effort pranks are the best kind of pranks.
That is true. Just like that time that I told you this show was going to air, whereas really I'm just sending embarrassing clips to your mother.
Why would you do that to me? Why would you do that?
I don't know. But I think it's really fascinating because I really would hope that these characters that come in seem to have nothing to do with it and are just thrown to the wayside have something to do with the series going forwards.
Yep.
And, we'll talk about this a bit later, but maybe we can find that out. But I doubt it. I very much doubt it.
They very much seem like one-note characters that, I'm the bullet man and I'm the secretary and I'm Fife. We don't really care about them. They're probably not going to come back later.
Yeah, I do expect that we'll have some of the police characters back, like obviously Markham, maybe Hagedorn, but the rest of them, it's just names on a page for the sake of it.
It's fine though. I do appreciate the level of detail or the time in the spotlight, I should say, that Lecoq gets in particular.
Yes.
That scene was the silliest.
It was very absurd.
It was a scene which it's the cross-examination. This is supposed to be a huge moment for the mystery where we finally sit down with the criminal and we figure out what's going on in their head. But it's totally thrown to the side. It's almost played for laughs in the way that Vance says, you're a fool. You're a fool, Lecoq. Why would you even bother doing this? You're a terrible liar. You're an idiot. Like,
it makes an absolute mockery out of the captain.
It's excellent.
Like, I really enjoyed the scene, but it feels entirely unwarranted.
Well, one of the things that particularly interested me is, as I say, it's definitely a staple of the genre, the cross-examination. Usually that's the most tense part of the novel, where we finally get to see the wits of the criminal played against the detective. But that scene in particular felt like it had no tension at all, mostly because I think most readers can even tell that Lecoq is just making things up on the spot. He continuously is forgetting things and trying to make stuff up, and we can tell and Vance can tell. And that's kind of a line running through the whole novel, is that the tension isn't really there. This isn't really a race against time. There's no sense that there'll be another murder. We are simply given this puzzle and we kind of meander about between the characters, asking them to come to us. There's no real feeling that anything is going on in this city other than this case itself.
Yeah. And I mean, I do like the way that Vance has played off the cross-examination. It feels like the most self-aware part of the book.
Sure.
In that he has gone like, don't you hate it when those cross-examinations really mean nothing and you can obviously tell that everyone's making it up? And he's making fun of that in this scene.
For sure.
Which, as I say, is probably the most self-aware moment in the book. But it maybe, it still doesn't feel super justified. Though admittedly, we do get one of the best lines in the book after it. Where he just calls the captain an idiot, and we move on.
You see how silly the confession is? What? Our pure and lofty captain is an incredibly poor Munchausen.
No one could lie as badly as he did who hadn't been brought into the world that way.
Now, probably one of the strangest things in this story, Herds, was the fact that it banks so much on psychology, but that the only times we ever get to see anybody's language is for the same two reasons.
What are those two reasons, Flex?
Lies and being impressed by Philo Vance.
I mean, yeah, like clues for the story and telling us how fantastic Vance is. That's
No. Let's be very clear here. It is not clues for the story.
Right.
It's specifically people lying.
I see.
We never get body language that actually implicates anyone with guilt. It's always them just lying.
Fair enough.
Now, I would like to extrapolate on this and say that by extension, one could assume that everyone is lying about being impressed by Philo Vance.
What? But he's perfect.
Arguable.
It's heresy.
Undeniable, according to SS Van Dyne. Completely implausible, according to anyone else who has read this book.
Well, we don't know what SS Van Dyne's body language was when he made that statement.
Oh, that's true.
We'll
if only he'd put that in the book.
If only he put his own body language in the book, this would be a very different book, I think.
That would be interesting if you had like at the bottom of every page of a story, just this was the author's body language while writing this. They have like a second writer that just sits across the room from them making notes on that and only that.
Somebody make that. I will pay money for that. Make a Kickstarter. Let's go.
Well, I'll write the mystery and you sit across from me and write down my body language.
I will. Let's do it.
I think one of the other things that I really did enjoy about this book, either blind or self-aware as it is, whichever it happens to be, and for all of the mistakes that it makes, it is a very consistent book in that it sets out to do something, does it the way it says it's going to do it, and gets there.
Yeah, it is a puzzle through and through, one might say. And following along with the 20 rules of Van Dyne's detective fiction certainly helps a lot in that regard.
Yeah, you are definitely going to get the book that you expect from this story. And I think that that's really wonderful because, sometimes books will surprise you positively, sometimes books would surprise you negatively, but it's really nice to meet expectations like straight out the gate.
No, for sure. We are told by Vance that he knows who the killer is 5 minutes in, and that's what happens. He says it's the Major Benson, and that's who it is. Yeah, it's kind of strange in that regard because murder mysteries are often expouted for their final twists. For I thought it was this killer, but it was actually this one the whole time. But even as you say, if so many people can guess the killer only 8 chapters in, it's doing its job.
Yeah,
it's like a well-oiled machine.
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, this was his first novel, right?
It was.
So we're judging him very harshly for what most people would consider to be a draft.
Yeah.
Like some people will come in and they will define a genre with their first story, but, Van Dyne is not one of those people, and that's okay. I don't think that the franchise will get better as you get further through it because of the reputation that we know it has from looking into it. But at the same time, it also seems like the kind of franchise that book 12 is going to be exactly as good as book 1. I enjoyed this book.
It's a comfort book, right? I have read one Philo Vance novel. The rest of them are probably not going to be anything different. They're not going to surprise you terribly. Although I would be interested in reading other books and maybe seeing what sorts of twists and turns that they might throw at us. But it's just a good book to sit by the fireplace in the armchair and have a little think about it,
Yeah, and even if you're not into dealing with Philo Vance, the insufferable written detective, there is a full series of movies out there, which we might be getting to if you stick around and listen on.
Oh my goodness, are you saying we're going to travel to the world of black and white picture?
I think we might have to.
Ooh, that's going to be fun.
That's coming up a bit later on the show. We'll talk a bit more about that. Right now, it's time to chat with Dr. Chris Coady from the University of Sydney, Senior Lecturer in Musicology, about jazz. Stick around.
You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SCR. This is Flex and Herds. We're here to slow things down and give you a break from thinking about all those brain-scratching puzzles, murder and death. So, we're chatting with Christopher Coady from the University of Sydney, a senior lecturer in musicology. He's here to talk about smooth jazz. Chris, welcome to the show.
No, thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. So, why was the early 20th century the perfect time for jazz to cultivate?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there are probably a lot of things that are happening in the earliest 20th century, particularly in New Orleans, that make, that a site that where jazz is sort of likely to emerge from. It's, New Orleans is really different from other parts of the United States. There's a sort of different rules around how people of different races and different backgrounds are interacting, particularly in the early 20th century. And so you have this jazz, which kind of comes from a range of different cultural traditions, some of them African traditions that had been transported to the United States, some of them sort of Western art song traditions that were alive and well in New Orleans, but sort of being performed regularly by people of color in that city. And so there's a lot of opportunity in New Orleans during the early 20th century for these musical ideas to kind of come together in new and exciting ways. So that's one of the reasons we sort of get it in New Orleans. I mean, one of the reasons that I think it resonates in the early 20th century is that you have this push toward being a modern society. People are thinking about what being modern means to them in all sorts of different ways, and you have this music that is this sort of hodgepodge of influences, this culmination of all these different influences in a way that people had not heard before. And so there's this real attempt by people from a range of different backgrounds to sort of, celebrate jazz as being a sign that, the United States is becoming a modern place.
And going off of that, talking about how it reflected a lot of the culture of the time, how much did jazz start to influence the culture that it was in itself? How do we see the broader impact of jazz moving forwards in the 20th century from there?
So when I am teaching jazz history in my class, I'm keen to point out that, jazz started in America, but like very, very quickly, it was like almost this global musical genre. So, very shortly after World War I, there are people in Europe and particularly in Paris playing jazz that in a lot of ways sounds like the jazz that was being made in the United States. And as jazz takes root in all of these different places, it also kind of starts to transform these individual locations. So you have, jazz taking root in New York, and you have like the music of Duke Ellington being performed at the Cotton Club, and this sort of orchestral kind of jazz, this big ensemble sort of jazz, and that gets people starting to think, oh, well, maybe jazz, can actually be a part of Western art music. Maybe jazz can be a serious music in the way that we've often understood music to be serious. And then at the same time, you have people not just in New Orleans, but in other cities continuing to play hot jazz, continuing to play like a jazz that would sound to our ears to be very early jazz, this polyphonic jazz, this jazz where instruments are all soloing at the same time, all playing together. And their argument is basically that, well, actually, this is the tradition that matters, that we should be celebrating, this kind of this roots-based music, that we don't have to become more Western, or we don't have to become more European in order to be taken seriously. This is something that should be taken seriously. And we have that divide still, in the way that we listen to African-American music. We have some sort of African-American music traditions that people are keen to point out have a real rooted sound, or that connect to the rooted side of the tradition. And we have others which have this more, European or Westernized sound. And people argue for the importance or the not so much importance of both of those in different ways. It's still very much the way that people are kind of talking about which kind of music is most valuable.
Yeah. So, Chris, what is the contrast you've observed between how jazz musicians historically have conceptualized their practice compared to modern times?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Obviously, there's initially sort of an entertainment focus, right? This is, jazz. I mean, I don't know if we can ever say that it was popular music. If it was ever popular music, it was popular during the swing era. And that's when it's functioning as an entertainment kind of music. But even in the swing era, you have bands that are trying to be like really experimental, like the 1930s equivalent of like prog rock kind of bands, weird forms in the music that they're putting together and sort of unusual orchestrations. And so that sense of taking oneself seriously as an artist actually goes back like quite a long way. I'd say that in the jazz world that we're looking at right now, that is predominantly the sort of the thinking that jazz, is highly valuable, really artistic music, not necessarily something that is played for entertainment, purposes. But, that's not a modern idea. Like that idea has actually been around, for quite a long time. It's just something that gained a lot more energy with the birth of bebop in the 1940s, and then the sort of explosion of jazz genres that we get in the 1950s with West Coast jazz and cool jazz, like the music played by the Modern Jazz Quartet, who I write quite a bit about. But yeah, it's an idea that goes back quite a way.
Now, as you were talking about with the kind of progressive and very compositionally focused parts of jazz, that kind of feels to me as the murder mystery connoisseur, kind of a similar touch where murder mystery was a lot about the puzzles and the intricacies of how you put it together, and jazz is known for complex and intricate progressive performances and compositions. Do you think that kind of approach to art of complex intricacies in creativity was something that reflected the times from when jazz started to originate?
Well, I think it's definitely something that, is reflected in jazz culture. Man, that is such an excellent question. And let me sort of explain why I'm excited by that question. I don't read that many murder mysteries, but the ones that I do, a huge part of the joy of reading those murder mysteries is like trying to figure out what happened. And you are kind of operating, or you're sort of building your logical framework up based on a awareness of what has happened in the past murder mystery novels you've read. That's why the genre kind of works. And that's definitely, the culture of jazz as well. So we have a lot of jazz works that we would see the title of us like a jazz standard like Autumn Leaves. But we never know like what that is going to sound like based on the title of that work. We would know the structure, the general structure. We'd know that, okay, well, there's like a harmonic framework, and we're probably going to hear glimpses of that harmonic framework as we move through the story of the music. And there's a melody, so we might not hear all of the melody, but we'll probably hear some key parts of the melody as we move through these familiar things. But we don't ever really know, how people are going to realize this sort of general narrative structure. And so I think, there's some really interesting overlaps in terms of how, creatively somebody goes about putting together a murder mystery story, and how somebody goes about putting together a jazz work that's going to resonate with lovers of jazz, people who've been listening to jazz for a long time.
Yeah. It's really interesting seeing where the topics of murder mystery and jazz in particular kind of coincide. Are there any works of literature that you can think of where jazz influence is particularly prominent, Chris?
Yeah, well, so I was thinking about that in sort of preparation for this interview. And I guess the novel that you guys are reading right now is set was it written in the 1920s or 1930s?
1920s.
The Benson murder case.
And I think what's interesting is that, in the first half of the 20th century, you have different kinds of jazz use in literature. So you have, people that are writing about jazz and are using it as a symbol of modernity, as sort of, a symbol of maybe industrialization, sort of a symbol of modern America. And then they wrap up into that all the things that are both good and bad. So sometimes there's like a bit of fear about jazz, you know, and that fear is kind of linked to a racist discourse around, you know, how people value African American music, or how much people are willing to actually seriously think about it. The writing of African American writers who write about jazz, and I guess the early 20th century one that I know the most about is Langston Hughes. You know, he has a really different sort of take on it. I think about like a poem that he wrote called The Weary Blues, where he uses all of those tropes of the writers who want to demonize jazz or treat jazz as a little bit scary, and he kind of flips those tropes on their head. He sort of uses them as a way of lampooning the commercialization of jazz and sort of the unknowing views of those who are just writing about jazz blindly without really understanding it. And so I think that divide, you know, that's definitely something later on when you start looking at the film noir texts like that use jazz a lot. You see that kind of reemerge. So you have composers who are maybe a little invested in jazz but aren't super invested in jazz, using it as a way of conjuring deviance or sort of conjuring, you know, the demi-monde or something like that. And then when you have, you know, John Lewis and Duke Ellington going in and writing film noir scores, they're trying to use jazz to get at that, you know, that ambivalent aspect of film noir, that idea that actually, you know, there are no real heroes, but there are also no real criminals. And they use jazz in their scores to kind of underscore those points.
Very cool. You've been listening to Death of the Reader. This was Flex and Herds with Christopher Coady from the University of Sydney. Thank you very much for chatting with us today, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on.
You're listening to Death of the Reader here on 2SER. This is your Murder Mystery World Tour. We are at the end of the Benson murder case, and it's time to talk about how fair this story was.
I think it was pretty fair.
I think it was very fair.
I mean, it's not as many twists and turns, except for ones that are kind of played for laughs anyway, because Vance is the worst.
Absolutely
the worst.
So,
yeah, it's a pretty straightforward novel overall. I'd give it like a 6 in terms of difficulty.
A 6, really?
You know, like I don't even know if it was that hard. That's about like standard detective murder mystery difficulty, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know, bad numbers.
I mean, this week we are discussing chapters 19 to the end. We're also talking about the fairness of the novel as a whole. And I think one of the interesting things about this novel, as we said earlier on in the show, is that it's very consistent and does what it sets out to do.
Yep.
You will not be bamboozled in any way by this novel, including really by the puzzle.
Yeah. It's not terribly difficult. As smart as Vance is, I feel like he's almost acting that intelligent because then the reader will feel that intelligent.
That is actually a really interesting point. Yeah, I hadn't really considered that.
I feel like that's the intent that he's going for. Like, hey, now you too can feel smart because this, you know, foppish upperclassman is saying all these smart things and you feel the same way. Isn't that funny?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier in the show, I got my family to read chapters 1 to 8 of this, and every single one of them pinged the major by the time we got there.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, on the one hand, does that say that the story is really easy, or is that perhaps a criticism of the way that we pick to do these stories, where by the fact that you said end at chapter 8, immediately we assume that all the clues are laid out there?
Well, this is one of those fun things about doing the show, isn't it? Picking a good place to stop, because on the one hand, I want to make sure there's enough clues. I thought that maybe because Fife is mentioned, that would be something that you kind of drive towards. But you're right, he doesn't actually appear on screen at that point. But also balancing the amount to read so it's not completely unreasonable. Like if I'd asked you to read up till chapter 19, I feel like we would not be a happy camper. But yeah, I suppose that's also down to the amount of time you have in your day.
And I mean, if you are doing this story along with us, perhaps the most accurate way to do it would be to go with the extended cut, which comes out at the end of each novel.
Yep.
We have all three of them together, and you can do it in one big long heap.
That's how I do it.
But, either way, I think that doing these stories segmented provides an interesting challenge, because also if you're the kind of reader that got to the end of chapter 8 and you think to yourself, I have no idea what's going on, you can stop and go, okay, there is supposed to be enough information to work with here. Go back and try, figure something extra out. And that, I think, is a really cool thing.
Yeah. Well, this is the fun part when we get to rules and stands and things. It was Knox, I think, in one of his blurbs in the Floating Admiral, he said something about having to present the culprit in the first 4 or 5 chapters, which clearly, if Fife was to be the culprit, Van Dyne would not be playing by that particular rule.
Absolutely.
Of course, he has his own set of rules. And that was kind of the fun thing, right? Working through this story with rules that we know. We know the 20 rules of Van Dyne. We have them online. You can go find them. But trying to figure out exactly how to apply them. And for me, I have my own special attachment to one of his rules, which says that there must be no love because murder mystery is not about love. And yet, when we were debating last week and I was straight up telling you exactly what was going on, and you were like, no, there's no way there will be love in this. It'll be that Major Benson has threatened Lecoq into, putting out this confession and saying they've done it. And I was saying, no, it's because he loves Sinclair, he wants to protect her. That's exactly what was going on the whole time.
And you know what? That's totally fine. I'm fine with making a mistake because it makes me seem human, unlike Philo Vance.
It does. You are not as inhuman as Philo Vance. You could put a little gold medal on your shirt there, and we know.
There was a lack of connection in that way between the Major and Captain Leacock.
Yep.
In that, they were two characters that were presented as being very formally close to each other by their connection in their old unit. But that was absolutely dropped by the time we got around to the solution.
Yep. Major Benson apparently had thrown that out the window in favor of framing him through way of framing Sinclair. And that turned into framing Lecoq in the end. This was his whole plan, was to frame one person and then by that virtue frame the next person and say, well, it couldn't possibly be Lecoq. It was definitely not him, so as to dissuade himself from being discovered on himself. And that's a very clever tactic. But you're right in that it doesn't make a lot of sense based on the raw information that we're given.
Yeah. I do think that raises an interesting point about red herrings in this story.
Yeah.
Like, we've obviously spoken that a lot of them get dropped, but if a lot of them get dropped in service of making it more of a challenge to solve, is that a better or worse thing? I would argue that it's worse, specifically because we get, to the end of the story and it's like, well, I wasted my time on this and that's not a great feeling. Yep. But at the same time, if you have a puzzle that's as clear down the line as this one, sometimes you just need something to distract. And I can see why Van Dyne did it, even if I don't necessarily like that.
Yeah, I mean, the best murder mysteries that have, this many red herrings will tie them into the story at the end in some way. One of the strange plot points end up happening was that Miss Hoffman and Mrs. Platts turn out to be related in the end, which is something that doesn't really matter to the story, but it's a good example of how you can take two characters and tie them together.
Yeah.
It's not like super well set up, but it is a plot point and explains why Mrs. Platts was so nervous in the beginning. And seeing, she's trying to protect Sinclair, but that doesn't make any sense. So now what about this character? What's happening? Is she affiliated with Major Benson? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah.
And then finally tying it around and saying, well, it was the secretary the entire time.
And I do, like, we were a bit harsh on that particular red herring in the first part of the show, but I do think that of the red herrings in the book, it's probably the best one.
Yeah.
And I do like that it ties it around. I wish that it had been a bit more integrated with what actually happened with the crime.
Yeah.
Like, maybe, Miss Platts actually was, doing something to work against Benson that made her get framed rather than her just happening to be the housemaid.
Yeah. There aren't a lot of active things being done by the characters. And I was touched on this earlier. How this very much feels like a game board or a chessboard where Vance is making a move and Major Benson is making his anti-move. Whenever we see Vance do some detectiving, or I guess it's more accurate to say that it's Markham versus Major Benson because Vance is actually not on the board at all. He's just floating above it. He sees everything that's going on. But we're watching these two characters going back and forth trying to accuse or deceive the other. But the other pieces don't really do anything. The other characters on the board just kind of sit there and get interrogated and are called in, called out. They're very passive in the way that they interact with the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like I guess you could say checkers versus chess in that chess has a lot more personality in the way the pieces are designed and the way that each can only do certain moves, whereas in checkers, there's a lot more linear narrative going on there, but it's still a very interesting tactical game.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it.
I will say, though, speaking of, rules and playing it down the line, this follows Van Dyne's rules so by the letter that I think it made it easy.
Yep, I agree.
It also follows Ronald Knox's rules, interestingly enough, which I think was fun and maybe says something about the context of those rules. If you're unfamiliar with those, we have specials on the podcast running through a lot of them. But I do like that for a man that's struck out and said, this is how you write a good story, he's done it. He's done the story the way he said he was going to.
Yeah.
I would say that you would have a better time with this novel if you didn't know the rules, because it would maybe make the puzzle a bit more challenging. But at the same time, if you're into picking apart stories and saying like, oh, well, this is why they did this and this is why they did this, it's fascinating seeing all of the rules be put in place like nearly one after the other.
If you're the kind of person who would sit down and cross-reference every single one of the 20 rules of Van Dyne and possibly the 20 of Knox with each chapter of the novel, you will love this book.
So many notes.
Flex loved this book.
So many notes. Do I have to take that golden pin off now?
No, you can keep it.
Oh,
you can keep it.
Thank you.
It's offset by your showing of love to these characters. Yeah.
Now, the other thing I have to take issue with, and this is maybe a bit separate from the story itself, Herds, is that you keep calling Lecoq.
I can't help myself. It's ingrained in my mind. Yeah, I mean, Lecoq, obviously named after Mr. Lecoq, who was one of the detective written by Émile Gaboriau. He's a bumbling fool in that, and it's very much reflected in the way that Van Dyne portrays Lecoq in this novel. He's very much a rube. He's very much being led around by these romantic notions. And it's funny to see the influence of Gaboriau, obviously a French murder mystery fiction writer, on Van Dyne's work.
And I do really enjoy that. It's definitely one of the examples of many in this book where he brings up other detective fiction authors and stories, including when he spoils one, in case you missed that.
Yeah. He's very clearly influenced by a lot of works, which I can appreciate.
Absolutely.
A writer who writes in a vacuum is going to create nothing but soulless trash. And so that's the harshest thing I'll ever say on this show.
Wow,
it's a nebulous accusation.
That is beefy.
And I know exactly who I'm thinking of when I say this, but I dare not say their name unless they come to the studio and throw androids at me or something. Anyway, I appreciate that he writes in context and that we can put him somewhere in history and say, these are the authors, these are the places where Chesterton has influenced, these are the places where Gaboriau has influenced, this is where Knox has influenced. I appreciate that we can put him somewhere in history. We can see that he's writing intelligently. He's not just throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. He has a very clear intent when writing this. And I admire that. I admire that attempt to go after a specific goal and achieve it.
Yeah, and I do think that, as we've said many times when discussing this book, it's either so self-aware it's brilliant or so blind that it's double-blinded itself into self-awareness.
Yes.
But either one of those results is self-aware.
Yep.
And regardless of how you perceive how Van Dyne wrote it, it still means that if you are reading this, you are getting a picture of early, 1930s detective fiction, 1920s detective fiction as a whole.
Yep.
And I love that.
Even if that picture hasn't aged very well.
Well, I mean, who would age very well after that many years?
I mean, you're right. I certainly wouldn't. I probably wouldn't even be here. I'd be like an old man sitting in some cabin out in the woods yelling at young people.
I'm really looking forward to SS Van Dyne himself just walking into this studio looking 20 years of age, having become the character that he set out to be, a fit, healthy aristocrat with
lots of
a
art.
Collection of art and a bunch of friends who hate him but don't really hate him. It's a bit like us, really.
I mean, basically.
Excluding the aristocracy and wealth. Just our relationship across this table here and our relationship with you is a bit like Markham.
I was going to say, we tell, are you saying that we tell everyone that we're best friends, but we actually hate each other? Is that what we're saying here?
Maybe it is.
Or maybe it's the opposite. I forget. One of those.
So, do we close this episode as Vance and Markham instead of Flex and Herds?
I feel like that's only appropriate. But before we disappear,
Yes.
I know that you have to tell me what novel we're doing for next week.
Herds,
For next 3 weeks, I hear.
I've come to bamboozle you.
What?
I know you're shocked. I know that I didn't warn you at all.
I am shocked.
We are doing another SS Van Dyne story.
Is that allowed by the rules that we've set down?
That is allowed by the rules we've never set down. You know what isn't allowed by the rules we never set down?
Tell me.
We're not allowed to do anything other than books, which is why next week we're doing the Kennel murder case by SS Van Dyne, the movie.
Oh my goodness. I'm looking forward to that.
Yes. Said by some critics to be the best murder mystery adaptation for film ever.
Ever?
Ever.
Including the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movies?
Including.
Wow. I can't imagine a higher bar.
Yeah. And the fun thing is, normally when we get to this point in the show and we say this is what we're doing next week, one of us has read it, so we know what's happening. I haven't watched the movie. I don't know what we're in for. I'm terrified.
We know what that means.
We're doing it as a 1-week special.
Yeah.
The Kennel murder case on Death of the Reader.
This is going to be great.
It is going to be a fun time.
I'll bring the popcorn.
We are Vance and Markham. This is Death of the Reader on 2SER. See you next week.
Next week, Vance.
That was part 3 of the Benson murder case, but Herds, we're not done yet.
A special feature!
Yes.
Time for the movie.
Feature, quite literally in many circles terms. We are talking the silver screen adaptation of the Kennel murder case.
We found ourselves all the way back in the black and white era of film with the Kennel murder case. And we'll be having Dr. Mike Grost on to have a chat about how much we love Van Dyne as a human being.
And once again, if you didn't catch our thanks at the beginning of the show, a huge shout out to Dr. Mike Grost for all of his amazing work. I did want to shout out before we get into this. One of our listeners actually was hitting me up on Twitter talking about the Kennel murder case, and he was saying, I feel like you're really overhyping this Kennel murder case movie. No. I feel like I'm going to have too high expectations going into it.
No way.
I agree. I think this movie's excellent.
Oh, excellent.
I was agreeing with you, not with them.
I was going to say, yeah, there's one scene in particular involving a model house. I'm just saying, it's perfect.
It's
perfect
fantastic. Perfect maybe not, but the best murder mystery adaptation to screen, definitely.
As close as we can get.
We are talking the Kennel murder case movie starring William Powell right now on Death of the Reader. This is the extended cut.
Enjoy.
This week on Death of the Reader.
Haven't you got any ideas at all, Vance?
It's movie night.
It's a maze of conflicting clues. Any one of 7 people might have done it.
As we tackle
We couldn't convict 7 people, Mr. Vance.
the Kennel murder case.
You couldn't convict 1 with the evidence you've got.
You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds, and this is your Murder Mystery World Tour. This week, Herds, we're doing something special.
This is the most special episode. This might be the most special episode so far. We're not doing a book.
We're doing a movie.
An entire film. Back from the good old days when movies weren't all 2 hours long. This one's a tasty, about 70-ish minutes long. It's pretty good.
Yes. If you've been struggling to keep up with all of the books, if you've been thinking to yourself, goodness, reading a book every 3 weeks is too much for me, well,
too much effort.
This is your week to catch up or get ahead of the pack and read the book that this movie is based off. We are talking The Kennel Murder Case by SS Van Dyne, the film adaptation starring William Powell from 1933.
If you haven't heard us discuss the Benson case, don't worry. Catch a spoiler chat as a bonus episode on the podcast.
We're going to start this episode with what is effectively a movie review, and that should be good fun.
Are we qualified for this? I think so.
I completely disagree, but we're going to do it anyway. And then towards the end of the show, we will be doing our regular nonsense with figuring out how this puzzle is done.
Yeah.
Let's get into this, Herds. I loved this movie.
It was a good time. I had some popcorn. I popped it in the microwave. I got myself sat down, and I watched the movie in the loving arms of my salty treats. I sat down and watched it all in one sitting, and I enjoyed every minute of it. I don't think there was an unnecessary scene or anything too terrible in it. I loved the transitions that the movie threw at me. There was all sorts of fun stuff going on there.
It was a very efficient movie, very clever, and I was along for the ride the whole time. There wasn't ever a moment where I was taken out and thought to myself, wait, what just happened? I think the thing I lost track of most often was who, because everyone's wearing the same outfit and it's all black and white, so it's extremely hard to distinguish who's who.
This is one of those fun differences between a book and a movie that with a movie where we're told what they look like, there were some characters that I could pick out immediately. Markham, I never lost track of Markham. And the Doctor, when he showed up, he was fantastic. He had some of the best comedy bits in the whole movie. And Vance, obviously, because he's Vance. He can't lose Vance. That's impossible. But with a book, you kind of make up these portraits in your mind for which character is which and who looks like what. I'll be honest, I pictured Markham more as the way that Heath was portrayed in this movie, which was a bit of a strange thing. One of the most interesting kind of details to separate the book from the movie was that we didn't have Van Dyne's kind of perspective.
We didn't have the author in the movie adaptation?
We didn't.
Oh, goodness.
So his ego is immediately deflated, which is very sad.
That's how you know this adaptation is just lost, gone to the wind.
I know. It's basically a completely different story from what I hear.
I thought it was really excellent. I think that losing the first-person perspective of Van Dyne makes a lot of sense for the movies. Obviously, this was a franchise of movies, so that's something that they did for the whole series, and I think it worked excellently.
Yeah.
The way that Vance comes across in the novels is so pretentious,
yes,
so forthright,
yes,
so utterly insufferable.
Oh, yes.
And one of the reasons for that is because the narration just keeps telling you how amazing he is with seemingly no justification.
And they just cut that out, and we only see the actions that Vance takes throughout the story. And he seems immediately more likable. Not necessarily likable, but more likable.
Yeah, and you know, Vance is still the same character, but I really love William Powell's portrayal of him.
Yeah.
He's cheery and he's kind of, like, you still get the idea that he's just an upperclassman along for the ride with the police.
He has class.
But, you know, he's along for the ride and he's bringing everyone with him, whereas in the books it feels like he's leaving everyone behind.
He's much more of a shepherd in this movie. He's showing people things and kind of hanging around in the background, and he doesn't even, no spoilers yet, but he doesn't even, you know, tackle the culprit to the ground and put handcuffs on them and say, I did it. I did everything. Yeah, which I love.
One of the excellent things about this movie and this book in particular is that it's one of the stories in the series that makes Vance seem human, which is not a character trait that he had for a lot of his franchise.
Yeah, I'd be interested to read the book all the way through and see how much of that is different or changed, because that's one of the most interesting questions when it comes to a film adaptation is what has the director done with the script, ostensibly.
Yeah, and I mean also what William Powell did with the character as
Absolutely.
well. How much of that is just his interpretation? Because I mean, we obviously interpreted the character very differently to how it's portrayed on screen.
Yeah.
And is that on us? Is that on them?
Yeah. Is it up to William Powell's endless charisma?
Indeed, indeed. Of course, that doesn't change the fact that everyone is still just utterly convinced by his charm for seemingly no good reason.
I feel like that's par for the course at this point.
That's just the character. There's not really much we can do about that.
He is designed to be the detective that everyone gets along with, I mean, except for Markham. And he runs around collecting clues. It's one of those funny tropes, of course, with detective stories where we wouldn't have much of an investigation if the characters kept getting in the way of the detective. Although at the same time, that sort of drama can be very, very compelling. In particular, with the fake confession trope. That's one of the more interesting parts of this movie.
Yeah, I really did love that moment when we get a fake confession, and we won't say from who, because you should go watch the movie. It was a great time.
It's very good.
But we get this fake confession, and Vance just goes, darling, I've seen this all before.
I've heard it 1,000 times. And he just walks away. He walks away.
Love it. One thing that I found really interesting about Dr. Doremus in this story is that, you know, not to say anything of what he does in the other stories, but he's remarked as being so bland, and that's why Vance loves him. But in this novel, he's a caricature.
He is the best character in the novel, I think. He was the character who every time he came on screen, I was excited to be there because they interrupt his breakfast, and then they interrupt his lunch, and now they're interrupting his bedtime. I love him. I just want to have him in every novel now as this goofy old man who just wants to be left alone.
I feel like that's a trope that we've seen in a lot of media, but it was really strange having come from another Van Dyne novel, seeing Dr. Doremus have this massive tonal shift.
I think it offsets the more serious tone of the rest of the story really well.
Oh, absolutely.
Giving that contrast there, especially from a character in the police force who I feel are supposed to kind of be in the background, and they just show up, they give their evidence, and they leave. Especially the doctor. You know, you say, this man died from poisoning. Bye. You know, they leave.
I thought the other one that was interesting in the police force was Heath, who basically just tried to punch on with anyone and everyone.
He was a big man, and he had a big heart and a big ability to punch people in the face. I loved him. Oh,
And it didn't ever pay off either. He never actually socked anyone.
that's all right. I'm sure one of these films we can find he's socking a criminal in the face.
I'm sure it's something that comes up in the franchise, but in this film alone, it felt a little bit left of the wind.
It was perfect.
I think one of the other things, and we'll talk about this coming up a bit later on the show with Dr. Mike Grost about the Van Dyne School of Detective Fiction, but the other thing that was really interesting about this story is the way that it treats Liang, the Chinese cook, who is one of the suspects in the case, but it treats him with a great deal of respect and dignity, which apparently wasn't actually commonplace back in the day. Like, it feels totally normal to us now, but supposedly that was a big cultural shift in that moment.
I was kind of surprised the way that we had his character introduction, because he introduces himself in the way that I feel most literature of the time would introduce him. He says, yes, me speak English. And then Vance says, no, please. I can tell that you're an educated individual who has like rights and a place in this household. Please speak to me like a regular human.
He says, where did you get your degree?
Exactly.
Excellent.
It's so quick. It's such a good way of humanizing the character and making them seem like a real person. It might be my favorite scene. Maybe my second favorite. My favorite is the model.
I will say my favorite scene did still involve Liang, which is when William Powell is testing out one of the tricks that he thinks makes the entire crime work. And Liang walks in to clean the room while he's doing it. And when Liang exits the room, William Powell just follows the door exactly and goes right back to what he was doing.
Yeah.
Like, it's very Chaplin.
Yes.
It's very Charlie Chaplin. The way that the motion flows throughout this whole movie has that beautiful charm of old cinema where they were just trying things for fun.
Yeah.
And it works.
There is an incredible sense of pace in this movie, the way that each scene flows into the other. A lot of the transition used to move us from one moment to the next, from one room to the next. There are some excellent moments that use what I assume is a dolly on rails, which is amazing. There are so many lovely tricks that the director has used to keep the action flowing and to keep us sort of in the moment. Especially where we're setting up the crime scene at the very end and William Powell is giving us his narration on how the crime was carried out. That was one of my favorite scenes. I'll put that as my third favorite.
Normally, that kind of atmosphere where we get into the territory of Rule 16 of Van Dyne's rules, where it says we should have no atmospheric dilly-dallying, I'd be like, come on, give us a bit of atmosphere. But the way that it did it in this movie, I think, worked effectively. There was still appropriate tension. There was still appropriate flow. There was still setting of the scene, but it was always something was happening.
Yes. I think that the big strength in that regard is that the atmosphere building is always happening while we're having characters talking and doing things. We don't get these long cinematic shots of the mountains of New Zealand. We don't have these like landscape situations going on. We have these tense moments of building towards something while we're getting information given to us, while we're watching characters discuss something important that's going to be a clue for later on. There's never just one thing happening on the screen, and that is it's so well put together.
I really particularly love the unveiling of Vance's solution at the end.
Yes.
To say nothing of how the solution works, the way that it's presented visually is gorgeous, particularly given the limitations that they had.
Yeah.
They bring out this model of the two buildings that the crime is set in, seemingly out of nowhere, and the shot is framed, so it seems like an exterior shot, but then someone just walks in the background, and it zooms out, and you can see them all standing around this model. And the way that they refer to the model as they're going through the solution is it's so nice, the way that it flows.
Gentlemen, I think I can fit the pieces of this jigsaw puzzle together. Now let's have a look inside.
Flex, I want to tell you right now, that scene, favorite scene in the whole movie.
Yeah.
I was totally 100% engaged when we had that reveal of the model. Who built that? Why does Vance have one? What is happening in that scene? I don't care. It's beautiful.
I feel like they probably just made it because getting exterior shots in the city of New York would have been too difficult. And then they were like, well, why don't we just actually use it?
You're absolutely correct. Like that's a trick that we see in films like Star Wars, where for the little TIE fighters and ships and things that need to blow up, they use little models. But why not just show it as an actual model in the film? That's ingenious. I love it.
It's absolutely fantastic. Could you imagine if Star Wars did the entire Death Star trench run, but with them standing around the actual models of the Death Star? That'd be fantastic.
That'd be beautiful. I want someone to make that for me.
I don't think it'd work.
It doesn't matter.
Be great.
It would be a theatrical and a film masterpiece.
Of course, having said that this movie does pacing well, uses everything very efficiently, there is one thing I feel is maybe a bit underutilized.
What's that, Flex?
that is the dog show itself, the setup for the Kennel murder case.
Yeah, it is a bit strange that we start off with all of these competitors and Philo Vance is involved and we get to find out how fantastic his dog is.
Yes, Philo Vance is apparently the best dog raiser in the country.
Apparently, but he doesn't win.
This is number 292, Captain McTavish, shown by the owner, the well-known fancier, Mr. Philo Vance, whose kennel comprises some of the finest campaigners in America.
But he doesn't win, so justice is served for the audience.
But
it's to humble him, obviously.
Yeah, but after we get the initial murder of Thomas MacDonald's dog, it just kind of drops the dogs all the way until the end.
Can I tell you what I thought this movie was going to be based on the premise?
Tell me.
I thought that it was going to be that one of the dogs died and we had to figure out who killed the dog.
I did as well.
I thought that was going to be the murder. I thought this is obviously the sticking point. It's going to be something a little bit more lighthearted. Nobody's going to die, except this poor dog. It's going to turn out he's been like poisoned through his food or something. But it just, the dog died and then we moved on, which is very sad. It gets the movie on didthedogdie.com at least. We don't
wait, didthedogdie.com?
Or doesthedogdie.com is the site. There's a site that you put all movies on where a dog dies.
Oh, I see.
And it's just so that people can be informed, so that then if a loving dog is going to die horribly, they will know.
Well, it's all right. The dog dies off screen anyway.
It's true. We don't even know who the dog is. I'll be honest. I wasn't very affected by it, which is, inhuman of me. I know. I'm a cat person, okay? Anyway, point is, there are dogs, but the dogs don't really matter to the story very much.
Yeah.
Which is strange. You've got this set piece and you don't utilize it. I don't know what happened there. I can't think in my mind of what the logical reason is for ignoring the dog showground and all of the tools. Why is the murder in our house when you have a showground with all of these tools that are used in the show? What about a dog collar or I don't know.
I don't have a problem with that.
I do.
What I have a problem with is that it sets it up and then the only time that the dogs ever become relevant again is right at the end when Captain McTavish walks into the house and solves the crime for Vance.
Let's be clear here.
They film that dog going the whole way up the stairs, the whole way back down. Why do they film it going up the stairs?
No one knows.
Why do they film it going down the stairs? Did we need to see every step that dog took in that house? How did the dog get to the house? It was in a car. Whose car was that parked outside? We never saw Vance get there. We think that Vance has a driver, but did the driver just bring the dog to come solve the case because the dog skippied its way into telling the driver that it had solved the case? It's ludicrous.
This is why I think that one of Vance's rules should be there should be no animals in this case at all. Just no animals. Just keep them out of here.
Well, I would argue the case that animals probably fall under the same rule as servants where they're not persons of note.
I see.
But still, I don't know. It's not... Of all of the weak points that this movie could have had, it's not a particularly egregious one.
This is, we should be clear here. This is a very well put together movie. It's just strange that there's this one plot point of there being a dog show and the dog show does not seem to matter. Even the motive for the murder, when we get down to that, doesn't really have too much to do with the dogs. It's very strange.
Yeah. And ultimately, this movie is remembered by many as one of the greatest Golden Age murder mystery adaptations for the silver screen ever. William K. Everson said that it was a masterpiece and considers it one of the top 2 movies of all time in murder mystery genre. So you don't just have to take our opinion for it. There is, backup out there.
There are actual reputable human beings who believe in this movie. Yes.
I don't know whether this is the best Philo Vance story out of the entire franchise, but I loved this movie, and I think you should check it out.
Well, maybe that's a challenge. Go read and watch every single Philo Vance novel and movie, and the other adaptations. I know there's at least one other Kennel murder case adaptation. Go watch and read all of them, and let us know which one's the best. Good luck.
This is Death of the Reader. Up next, we are talking with Dr. Mike Grost about the Van Dyne School of Writers. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader on 2SER. We are Flex and Herds, and joining us today is Dr. Mike Grost, a murder mystery enthusiast and author of one of the best online databases for mystery fiction, which has been invaluable. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, if you're not familiar with Mike's work, his personal website contains information on anything and everything detective fiction, and as I said, has been utterly invaluable to us in tracing the connections between authors on our murder mystery world tour. Mike, how did you first get involved in chronicling the complexities of mystery fiction?
I started reading mystery fiction when I was a little boy in the 1960s, and I bought a lot of used books, and one of them was S.S. Van Dyne's The World's Great Detective Stories. And the 35-page introduction to that is the first history of mystery fiction, the pioneering history from 1928. And I was fascinated, and I thought, wow, I want to learn more about the history of mystery fiction. And when I grew up, I was inspired to try to write a modern-day history of mystery fiction, directly inspired by today's author, S.S. Van Dyne. So it's I've been influenced by certain schools of criticism, especially auteur criticism and film history.
Now, Mike, Van Dyne's fiction focused on these 300-page murder mysteries with complex plots. What stands out to you as the greatest strength of the man's construction of his stories?
I think it's a very elaborate form of storytelling where he has, as you say, very complex plot, and every detail falls into a logical place there. And the whole thing is like a piece of music where you start out and you develop themes and the story progresses logically, and bit by bit, hundreds and eventually thousands of little pieces and details are all put into a mosaic, sort of like you would find in a symphony or opera. He's a superb storyteller, and he's got an enormous gift for telling detail. I also like his very literate prose. S.S. Van Dyne was a confirmed intellectual. He wrote beautiful advanced prose, and it's a joy to read.
I have to ask, Mike, you're giving him a lot of praise here. Does the man have any flaws?
Yes, I would say some of the books are not very good. The Casino Murder Case is very weak. There is snobism in his work. He made his hero be wealthy. And most of the people he influenced didn't do that. They had more middle-class detectives generally in the people he influenced. But my opinion is that S.S. Van Dyne was a major figure in our modern culture, and he influenced a lot of aspects of modern culture, and he's underrated right now as a writer. So I think it's more productive now to concentrate on his best books. I would say that his first 5 novels from the 1920s, and then in the 1930s, The Dragon Murder Case and Kidnap Murder Case. Those 7 books, I think, are his biggest achievements.
Yeah, now, as you say, many authors take influence from Van Dyne, even though he's kind of been forgotten by the rest of history. As a member of what you call the Van Dyne School of Detective Fiction, authors such as Ellery Queen, Stuart Palmer, Rex Stout, all took inspiration from his works. What are some of the common themes within that school of authors that stand out to you?
One thing is that they have a typical plan where there's an amateur detective who's a genius and very good at pure reasoning and thinking, and that amateur detective works in close, happy collaboration with the police. And that's not a plan for a realistic detective novel, but as far as an entertaining, well-constructed mystery story, you could hardly beat it as a plan. That's one of the main things, the patterns that the Van Dyne School of Writers took from him. Another is the fact that the Van Dyne books and the successors tend to have some sort of background set against either intellectuals or people in the entertainment industry considered broadly. Stage, radio, film, the arts, opera, ballet, something like that as a thing. Or, as I say, they're intellectuals. They're scholars. They're work in museums. They're art experts. They're collectors. So you have a background against the intelligentsia, told in the form of a literate novel, usually with witty dialogue, upbeat tone, good deal of intellectual sophistication. So you have a sort of entertainment for people who are interested in the intellectual world.
Yeah.
A very positive, joyous look at intellectuals in a big city and the sort of things they talk about and are interested in.
Yeah, I remember speaking to Simon Brett, a modern detective fiction author, who said something very similar in that a lot of his work reflects his interest in show business these days. Yes,
very much so. And probably the ancestor to that, I can't speak for Simon Brett, who is a talented writer, a very prolific, talented writer, but my guess is probably somewhere in his ancestry as a Van Dyne influence, because Van Dyne was the person who put this sort of approach on the map. So these two things are really big: the amateur detective police collaboration and the intellectual background and advanced writing. Those are two key things. There's some other things in the Van Dyne School. There tends to be a lot of interest in the time of the murder and the movement of suspects around the murder scene. And these are often linked to interesting architecture and interesting maps of cities and city streets. And you can see this in the Kennel murder mystery. It takes place in a New York brownstone, which is described. It's an interesting architectural setting. There's two floor maps of the two main floors of the brownstone, and there's also a map of the city street outside in the intricate pattern of buildings, gates, vacant lots, and paths which connect everything up. So the whole novel is set against these backgrounds, and you can follow them right on the floor plans and maps. That's also fairly common in Van Dyne School writers. A couple other things. They're not the only people to include impossible crimes in locked rooms, but they sure included a lot of them in their writings and some real doozies. And there's a nice standard locked room mystery in the Kennel murder case we're talking about. So there's been an interest in sometimes bizarre murder methods, and it takes quite a while for people to figure out in the Kennel murder case how the heck Archer Coe was actually murdered. We will not spoil that here, but it's certainly startling and strange, and it's a sort of surrealism that often pops up in both Van Dyne School writers and some other schools of contemporary mystery fiction, where things are strange, bizarre, odd, weird, startling. And it's sort of a lower S surrealism that runs parallel to the capital S surrealism in the art world.
How do you find, from an author's perspective, authors can balance having those complex surrealist puzzles, which can be really difficult to figure out, and making the stories accessible for their audience without, leaving them out in the cold, fretting about at what time the train arrived at the station?
That you have to write very clearly. And Van Dyne is a very clear writer. I've never been confused by any of his books. And most of the people who wrote in the Van Dyne School were very clear professional writers. So that's one thing. And there's lots of the detectives are always trying to highlight and summarize the facts. You'll see there's a part when everybody's completely baffled toward the beginning of the Kennel murder case, and Philo Vance, the detective, gives everybody, the police and the reader, a summary of the strange events so far. And it sure helps this reader to get a clear summary, and the Van Dyne writers are doing it. Writing mystery fiction is a difficult thing. Its skill level has often been underestimated by people. People have often depicted it as inferior to standard realistic fiction, artistically, and that's a complex discussion. But it's, as a craft level, it's a very, very demanding field. It's not for the faint of heart. You've got to be able to come up with a clever mystery plot, rapid and entertaining storytelling, and write it in literate prose with sparkling dialogue. And that's a tall order, and it's amazing to me that so many people were able to do this over the past 200 years.
Another detail of the Van Dyne School of Murder Mystery Fiction that you mention on your website is that a lot of authors contributed verses or passages of their prose towards early social movements, such as in the Kennel murder case, Philo Vance's treatment of Liang the cook, and also later on in a book that we're going to be covering coming down the line, Too Many Cooks, the treatment of other minorities. Why is it you think that the authors of detective fiction were so forwards in putting this social commentary into their stories that many people just consider to be about the puzzle?
I cover on my website 45 members of the Van Dyne School. It was a huge school and very popular. Many of these people were political liberals who had a strong personal belief in civil rights and the equality of the races, and you certainly see that in Van Dyne. And as you say, with Liang the cook, the book goes out of the way in the final interview, which Philo Vance, the detective, conducts with Liang. The writer says that Vance addressed Liang as an equal. He treated him with, it's mentioned that he treated him respectfully. He told Liang that Liang did exactly what Philo Vance would have done under the same circumstances. They allow each other to question each other. Philo Vance is not usually a man who submits to questions, but in Liang's case, he's eager to answer any of his questions. So it's very much a deep, deep commitment to equality between people. I wish I knew the answer why some people believe in racial equality and other people don't. If I could find a cure for racism, they'd give me the Nobel Peace Prize. But and I would just, anyone who could contribute to it deserves it. But as I say, there's of the 45 Van Dyne School writers I cover, 20 took career risks to include positive treatments of all sorts of minorities, racial minorities, sexual minorities, religious minorities. They went all out to do this. And as you mentioned, Rex Stout's Too Many Cooks is a classic example, and I strongly suspect it was influenced by the Kennel murder case, as I say on my website. Certainly, Rex Stout was strongly influenced by Van Dyne in general, and it wouldn't surprise me that when he wrote Too Many Cooks, he used the Kennel murder case as a model. Just a thought.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned earlier, Mike, Van Dyne often features entertainers, enthusiasts, and art collectors in his writing, and Philo Vance is no exception, being a critic himself. How do you think his brother Stanton McDonald Wright's influence is prevalent there?
I think that Van Dyne was a art critic himself. He wrote a major book called Modern Painting. He had a life history as an intellectual as well as a mystery writer, and Modern Painting was like a survey of the world of what we now call modern art. And in the climactic chapter, it treats the whole world of modern art as climaxing in Van Dyne's brother Stanton, which is perhaps a little bit of an exaggeration. I'm not sure he was as important as Mondrian or Kandinsky, but Stanton McDonald White was a terrific abstract painter with a long and very distinguished career. He didn't die young the way S.S. Van Dyne did. He lived into a ripe old age and just kept painting and painting. There's a large body of his works available online now, and many of them are astonishingly creative. Stanton's work centered on the use of color. And Van Dyne wrote a second book called The Future of Painting, where he predicted that technology would allow people to do more and more things with color. And even in Van Dyne's area, he talked about light machines that could produce color. Van Dyne would be absolutely thrilled with modern computer systems and their ability to manipulate color and light in a direct way. In some way, he was a prophet of that. Van Dyne also tried to influence Hollywood and the film industry in making experimental films that were abstract and involved complex color and design. He hoped to get his brother involved as a designer in making such of these films. Hollywood did not bite. And it's too bad. In some ways, you could say was a waste of Van Dyne's time. But there's certainly been many, many pictorially beautiful films coming out of Hollywood, less experimental perhaps than Van Dyne hoped. But if you look at great pictorialist filmmakers, you see impressive visual beauty on screen. John Ford, Joseph H. Lewis, Vincent Minnelli, Jacques Tourneur, Bud Bedecker, and Raoul Walsh, and so on, Fritz Lang, many, many visually brilliant filmmakers. So Van Dyne tried to prophesy that. He personally failed to launch a Hollywood career doing that, but it wasn't for lack of very serious effort in trying.
S.S. Van Dyne was particularly critical of Agatha Christie's works, focusing on her lack of fair play in her mystery construction. We also know that Christie read his works right back. Is this an example of a murder mystery Cold War between the two authors?
I'm not sure. Van Dyne's book was published at an era, his major writing on Christie came out, and everybody else came out in 1928, and Christie had only published like 4 or 5 books at that time. He is very slighting about her in the book, and I think he made a mistake. but it's also true that he hadn't maybe seen most of Christie's best works that hadn't been published at that time. I know from Christie's letters that she read Van Dyne. So and she seems to have admired his work. Van Dyne was very popular in Britain. Most British critics viewed him highly, in my impression at that time, as one of the best American writers.
Yeah, it might just be a question of experience at the time and how much work in the field they'd both completed. So Agatha Christie hadn't written as many novels as Van Dyne, kind of looking down on that, and she still needed a bit more time to boil, so to speak.
Yes, she did. She was just starting her greatest period in 1928 when Van Dyne wrote his History of Mystery Fiction. She launched the big series of 14 Poirot novels that were great. She wrote her Miss Marple short stories and many other classic short stories in that period. Tommy and Tuppence, the Harley Quinn tales, and so on. And these are all very, very brilliant works. And it's possible if Van Dyne had gone. Now, he did get a chance towards the end of his life to write reviews of a lot of mystery fiction that authors that weren't covered in his book in 1928. And the historian Mike Toomey has unearthed a lot of these things. Some of them are now available online. And Van Dyne got a chance to favorably praise a lot of people who regard as major writers. Like he was a great admirer of John Dixon Carr, Ulf Stanley Gardner, and quite a few other writers who he'd hardly known about or had hardly begun writing at the time when he put out The World's Great Detective Stories in 28. So this gives a little more balance to Van Dyne's work. He was a very broad enthusiast over a very large range of his contemporaries. He usually was not snide or negative, although he was with Christie, but he's usually enthusiastic and admiring.
Which is a very different perspective from perhaps what some people portray him as these days, which is very interesting and I guess unfortunate to some extent.
Van Dyne in person, I'm sure, could be difficult. He had problems with substance abuse. He had womanizing issues. He could be acerbic to people. And I'm certainly not saying he was a saint. He did put, I think, the best of himself in his writing. And we have to just to be accepting of that and say, okay, we can be grateful that he accomplished so much as a writer. And I'm not here to sit in judgment on him as a person. I agree. He's everything I've read about him makes it sound like he could have been a difficult person.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mike Grost, for coming on the show. This has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you about Van Dyne, his work, and his influences.
Thank you. It's been great to be invited. I appreciate it.
Thanks for chatting.
And once again, a thank you to Dr. Mike Grost for his online database of murder mystery knowledge. We'll chuck a link up on the podcast, and you should absolutely check it out. It is fascinating reading and very well put together.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the compliment.
This is Death of the Reader. We are Flex and Herds, and we'll be back with the Kennel murder case in just a second.
Well, we did it again, Mr. Vance.
Congratulations, Sergeant.
Thank you. I'll certainly mention you in my story to the papers.
Thank you.
Oh, that's all right, Mr. Vance.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are talking the Kennel murder case film adaptation. And, Herds, it's time to talk theories, solutions, and was this puzzle fair?
I mean, yes. It was a puzzle. There was a culprit. I will tell you, I did not see it coming. My money was on Brisbane, but that went down the toilet very quickly.
It went right in the closet.
I'll tell you my thought process here. I wanna walk you through, because I know that there are some murder mysteries out there where the trick is always to find the character who's obsessed with murder mysteries and they're the culprit, because that's usually what writers do. So when I saw Brisbane, before the murder even happened, with the book about murder mysteries, I was like, all right, I got him. Dead to rights. He's in my sights. Take him down to the pound. Not at all. He was dead. He was dead the entire time. He didn't even kill anyone. He tried to kill someone. He didn't kill anyone.
He shot a dead man. That was all he achieved.
So I caught a man who shot a dead man and something about pans.
I mean, he already got his justice. You could have made a joke about Vance there. We're sitting right in front of you. Sitting right there.
It's all right. I'll get him next time.
No, I really love the solution to this story.
Yeah.
It's clever. It's not exceedingly over the top with all of the evidence that it needs you to look at.
No.
The thing that I think makes this novel stand out, and probably why people like it so much among the Philo Vance collection, is that it just gives you a culprit.
Yeah.
It gives you a culprit, so you can feel satisfied that you solved something when you get to the end, even if you didn't get the twist.
Even if it was just really easy to do. It doesn't matter. I did really enjoy that, actually. I did enjoy the way that SS Van Dyne portrayed this situation with not two culprits, but one culprit and one, man who shot a corpse.
Yeah.
But we're given the situation where all of the characters in the story, like these 7 characters, apparently all have motive for murder. And 2 of them are involved in the murder, which I really like. I haven't really read a story that has been quite like that, where all of the evidence points to one character. It turns out, they got caught in the middle of their murder. It does rely on this strange series of events where a man is stabbed to death, but then they walk to their room and then die after walking to their room. Like, that's a little bit of something there, but I really enjoy the way that twist is handled in the film.
I mean, I don't think it's particularly far-fetched. It makes sense that you were, stabbed in a non-vital place. You go up, you don't quite realize what's happened because you're lightheaded. You're not realizing what's going on. The way that it portrays it, it's a pretty abstract solution. I definitely did not get the way that the crime happened. I figured who the culprit was through almost sheer luck, so I'm not going to take any credit.
Of course you did.
I'm not going to take any credit for it.
Sheer luck, whatever.
When we get up there and we think it's a solution that you will not go, that's nonsense. That couldn't have happened. It's a solution that you go, damn, that was right there.
Yeah. It's not a totally incomprehensible solution, and that, I think, is what's most fun about it, that Van Dyne he's kind of stretching logic. He's stretching the bounds of what is reasonable, but I don't think he quite breaks that mold, right? Or he doesn't break that expectation too hard. Because even in the end, we only have one culprit. He doesn't even break that rule.
Let's talk about rules, Herds.
Oh, no.
Because I got a problem.
What's your problem?
I got a problem, and the problem starts with the number 20 and the letter E.
Oh, no. The dog?
The dog. Let's just quickly go over a particular Van Dyne rule. So, Rule 20, I herewith list a few of the devices which no self-respecting detective story writer will now avail himself of. Article E, the dog that does not bark and thereby reveals the fact the intruder is familiar.
Okay.
Now listen, I understand that the dog attacked someone who is familiar,
yes,
and thus it is an inversion of the rule.
It is an inversion.
But clearly, using the dog to identify the culprit goes against Van Dyne's own rules, and I will not stand for it.
Well, to be fair, he doesn't just identify the victim. Vance already knows who it is at the point anyway, but it's not the victim themselves, but also the situation they're put in. They are logically placed in this situation by being forced to pick up the poker. There's a little bit of a logic game going on there. I know what you talk about. I think that's a breaking of the rule.
But I mean, we're also dealing with the fact that supposedly the dog is reacting to the poker because he doesn't react when they're just all in the room together, which means that it could have been either person. And that they then convict the guy on that. Like, I'm assuming after the movie ends, he confesses and yada, yada, yada. But the film ends before they actually have any hardline proof other than the fact that, it was, the dog barked at that guy.
I mean, he confessed in the film, basically. He said, it was an accident killing that guy and killing that guy, but I would have stabbed Thomas again if I could.
I'm just saying Reed was an amateur. He could have just said the dog just attacked me because he doesn't like weapons.
Because he doesn't like pokers?
Exactly.
I don't know. Dogs love pokers.
It's
honestly
flimsy evidence. He would not be convicted.
Look, really, I feel like even if you're arguing that rule is being broken, that is the most human I think that Vance is in the movie. He's not making these long-winded logical deductions. He's just saying, hey, dog.
Wait,
attack.
He's human when he makes a dog attack someone?
Yes.
What is human about that, Herds?
Because Vance isn't sure how to proceed.
Gentlemen, I'm afraid we're completely stopped. Vance, in all the years we've worked together, I never heard you say that before.
He's stuck in that moment.
You're saying that his infallibility is finally broken?
Well, I don't know about broken, because he's Vance and nobody can break his absolute perfectness. But he doesn't have a perfect conviction of the killer in the end.
I mean, I would argue that he doesn't after the dog anyway until the confession comes out. But
But he has to rely on something other than his own wits and guile to catch the killer.
Yeah, no, that's fair. He doesn't just look at the culprit charismatically and they concede everything. I suppose that's true.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that the humanity with which William Powell presents Philo Vance is one of the strong suits of this movie. So I can let that one slide.
Damn right.
But let's move on, Herds.
Oh, come on.
We've got rule number 12, which is that there can only be one killer no matter how many murders there are. Now listen,
There's only one killer.
I know that
There's only one killer.
I know that Brisbane Co. only shot one person in the head, but the rule goes on to say that it is a cat and mouse game between a detective and a culprit. If Vance has to solve two culprits, that's more than a cat and a mouse.
So
That's two mice.
Here's my argument here. One of those mice is dead the entire time. They're not actually in a game with Vance. There is no cat and two mice. It's a cat and one mouse, and the other mouse is dead in the closet. It's straight up what that is. This is not a debate between three people. This is between two people, but there's just extra pieces to throw around, extra coins to juggle.
I suppose you are right. I suppose you are correct in that.
I just think that you're giving a lot of flack.
Culprit number 2 cannot add anything more to the crime once it is done.
Yeah, this is not two heads better than one. This is one head trying to deal with extra problems because of a second person who was trying to be the culprit but failed. So they are strictly not a culprit.
Well, it's just that we've been so hard on SS Van Dyne this whole time because he's so judgmental and so projecting and clearly, loves these rules and how to use them and supposedly, ne'er-do-wells like people who just have ordinary jobs aren't interesting enough for a murder mystery.
Yeah.
So if he's going to make all these rules, he better damn stick to them. And if he's bending them like this, I don't know if I can have it.
I don't know. I think this is pretty reasonable. As this is the sixth book in the series, I think that Van Dyne is just showing us that maybe the pretentiousness that we accuse him of isn't as ironclad as we think. Maybe it is okay to bend these rules very slightly, Maybe he's not as blind. Maybe he is double blind, as we've said in previous episodes.
I suppose I can concede this. I would very much like if SS Van Dyne is completely self-aware and it is in fact us that have double-blinded ourselves into self-awareness.
Maybe it is.
But we've said rules are defined or they're breaking. Mm-hmm. And I think that bending the rules is totally fine.
I don't even think this isn't even breaking. This is just a little bit of a bend. The dog is not familiar with him because it does not remain silent because it is familiar with him. And there are not two culprits. There's only one culprit and only one person fighting the detective in the end. It's just one person.
Yeah. And the problem that I have with the bending of these rules is more that, I have an image in my head, Herds, and I want it to be maintained. I want to separate our blessed Father Knox from our blessed SS Van Dyne.
I know that. I know
when they start to blur the lines and become self-aware, it's too much for me.
I know that whenever you're presented with two characters, two opposing opinions, you wanna see them as being on these opposite sides of this one issue. There's only one way to look at murder mystery. It's Van Dyne's or it's Knox's. It's Flex or Herds. But sometimes those two opposites, they can come together and they can agree on something.
That's absurd. Absolutely.
Maybe they can. Maybe they can be friends.
We'll never agree on anything.
Maybe we can be friends, Flex.
I think the other thing we should talk about now that we brought it up is Knox's rules. Device X, Herds.
Device X, I don't know that I have much of defense for this. String is pretty easy to work out. It's just a pulley system. That's not too complex.
Do you think that the average reader in 1928 would have had a fair understanding of how pulleys work?
Not in 1928. Maybe that's
micro-scale pulleys on sewing thread.
Maybe that's the interesting thing that nowadays, maybe Van Dyne would have been better off writing an RH because I would say the common person, would know how a pulley system works. Maybe it's fair play now, even if it wasn't back then. Huh?
I would actually argue, having thought about this, maybe it was more commonplace back then.
You think so? You think more people would know how a pulley works?
Maybe that's why he was okay with using it.
The factory workers.
That wasn't necessarily what I was pinning it on, but maybe that is a way you could direct that.
Maybe it is.
But, it's certainly an interesting one. Yeah. Do we accept this? The other thing is that we have locked rooms. And locked rooms, as we've said on the show, are a staple of the genre.
Yes. It was, when I saw that was the device that we were going to use to solve the locked room, I was actually a little bit confused. I thought it was going to turn out that there was a ladder somewhere so they could sneak up through the windows because it had been established that that Code liked the windows being open, or that one of the servants, let him out, or there was somebody hiding, or some other trick. It was interesting to see a murder mystery that actually uses the, replace the lock from the outside trick, because that's not. I feel like nowadays that's very much considered to be foul play.
Well, the problem is that once you've shown a way to undo a lock from the outside, locked rooms are meaningless.
It's true.
And maybe that is part of the self-awareness that Van Dyne is showing in this story.
Maybe.
But the problem is that if you want to have a locked room mystery, the locks need to function. If the locks are meaningless because you have a pulley system, what's the point?
Well, to be fair, the secret to almost any locked room mystery, spoilers for locked room mysteries, is that they're not locked rooms to begin with.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, that's the fun part, is that if you're presented with a room that they say, well, there's no possible way the murderer could have gotten in and out, it has to be suicide, it has to be this, that, and the other, there is a trick there. You are being invited by the storyteller, by the author, to solve it and figure out why it's not actually a locked room at all.
Yeah, and the interesting balance of the defense of this is that on the one side, it's a simple solution with a couple of pulleys that means that you can get the lock open nice and easy, doesn't require much explanation. On the other hand, because that's a simple mechanism that could work on so many doors, it's like, well, fare thee well, locked room mysteries.
Exactly. This is the problem. If you're going to set up a locked room mystery, then after that solution has been put forward, then you have to say, the detective has to say, well, could it have been a system of pulleys or perhaps a lock pick that has put the lock back in place or something fancy like that? And then you have to then deny it. You have to say, well, there are no lock picks here. There is no rope. There is no rope near this locked room. Don't worry about it. I've searched the whole town. No one's got any rope or any pulley systems. Just don't worry about it.
I will say, at least the film foreshadows it effectively. At least we see the book the solution comes from. At least we see the text before Vance figures it out.
Yes.
I'm okay with it in this story, but in the broader context of mystery novels, lock them doors.
Yes.
And keep them locked.
Yes, this is a good point. You definitely want to set those expectations at the start of the novel. Locked rooms are real things, and trying to puzzle out, who has gone where or what alibi is being used is always the most interesting part of a locked room mystery.
Now, the final question, Herds, was this fair?
I think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that picking Reed of our multiple suspects was pretty difficult.
Yeah.
Like, I only guessed it basically because he was the first possible person with the Van Dyne rules that appeared on screen.
I feel like if I wasn't already thinking it was Brisbane, I probably would have picked Reed, because I saw Gamble walk up to the door and went, oh, well, it's not him because he's a servant. But then Reed is the very next person on the scene.
Yeah. And if you go back and you watch over it again, there's definitely evidence. There's, him directing them this way and him misleading them in various other ways.
Yeah.
But the problem is that every suspect has that. There's no one thing that makes him stand out amongst the cast. I don't think this story is unfair, but I do think that its solution is unclear.
Yeah. I think this might be partially due to the filmic nature of the story that we were watching, because it is only an hour long. With a novel, you have hours upon hours of sitting and reading through things and poring over minute details. I mean, I'd forgotten who Reed was by the end, and this is partly due to the forgetting which character is which. But yeah, I do think that it is fair, especially going over it again and seeing, oh, well, that's where Reed was in this scene. These are the clues that he's dropping around. And as we've said a couple of times now, the solution and the method by which we follow the criminal's path through the house after and even during the killing is just so well laid out.
Yeah. No, it does not ruin the movie for me, but it definitely is not a puzzle that I point at and say that was one that I really enjoyed solving. It was one I enjoyed experiencing.
Yeah.
We'll have to see maybe later down the line if the book holds up to the same scrutiny. But, the satisfaction comes in you figuring out if it was Brisbane who was involved before they unveil it to you there.
Yeah, for sure.
Either way, that has been our special on the Kennel murder case movie starring William Powell as Philo Vance.
Yeah, and we're going to be continuing next week with a brand new novel that
a regular novel?
Yeah,
We're not becoming a movie show?
But it is, oh my goodness, I would love to do that, but unfortunately we have all these novels to get through. We're going to be continuing with a larger-than-life legend of crime fiction. We're going to be looking at Rex Stout's Too Many Cooks, featuring Nero Wolfe.
Yes.
And we're going to be looking at chapters 1 to 6 inclusive. I'm very much looking forward to this, Flex.
Yes. The one thing I know going into this novel is that it was part of the Van Dyne School of Writing we spoke with Dr. Mike Grost about earlier on this episode. So maybe we'll see a bit of interesting social commentary in there.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm looking forward to the recipes about food.
Sorry, what?
Next time, we will discuss the recipes that were released as a part of this.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah, it's a whole promotional thing. I'm excited to talk about it.
If you want to catch any other movie content on 2SCR, we have Film Fight Club Wednesdays at 7:30 p.m. We have Regular Size Kev on Friday daily. And you can catch our very own Michael Jones on breakfast with his movie reviews. This has been Death of the Reader. We are Flex and Herds, and we'll see you with Too Many Cooks next week.
Next time.
And Herds, it is with a somber farewell that we must bid our fine listeners good day here at the end of the extended cut.
It's the end of Van Dyne, Flex. It's the end of this episode. But hopefully, as we continue on into this black and darkened night, we'll remember and see Van Dyne's influence on the other great murder mystery authors of our time.
Yeah.
We'll be moving on next week to Rex Stout's Too Many Cooks, starring Nero Wolfe, which I am particularly excited for.
Yes, and Dr. Mike Grost himself said that this book was inspired heavily by their Kennel murder case. So it should be interesting to see how those influences make themselves apparent.
I'm looking forward to picking it apart. And the food. Aha!
This has been the extended cut on Death of the Reader. Thank you to all of our guests. If you want to subscribe to the show, you can get us on iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Whooshka, anywhere you get your podcasts.
We're probably there.
We're probably there.
I give it a 90% chance.
You can also catch up with us at Flex and Herds on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And if you want to know anything about upcoming books, drop us a line in the DMs and you can get a head start on your reading.
We'll see you next time.